What was supposed to be a romantic anniversary hike has turned deadly. Toni Henthorn's husband, Harold, says she accidentally slipped and fell to her death off a 160-foot cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park. That puts this case in the jurisdiction of the Federal Park Service, and they launch an investigation into exactly what happened up on that mountain.
Ranger Faradian made arrangements to go to Harold Henthorn's house and interview him, because there's still a lot of questions we need to ask.
One of the things I had brought with me was a memory card from Tony's camera, and I showed him some of the pictures off the camera, and he acted upset. He said, "That's my wife, Mark. That's my wife," as he looked at pictures of Toni.
You guys were able to get pictures from Toni's camera and Harold's cell phone. How important were these pictures in piecing together your investigation?
The pictures were extremely important to the investigation in terms of building a footprint of what they did that day. So this is them in front of the Stanley, which is a big hotel in Estes Park the night before. The next morning, they had breakfast, and then they went and picked up some sandwiches. But you can see Toni's in the car. She's got her lipstick on. She's looking happy. This photo is them at what we've dubbed the lunch spot. We know that they had lunch there. It's a very key spot to the investigation. What Harold had told Mark was they hiked up till the trail plateaued. They wanted to get off the trail for some privacy. When we recreated their steps, there's no trail where Toni and Harold had lunch. It's not cleared in any way, and it's pretty difficult hiking. We were actually able to determine that this is indeed where they did have lunch.
It's a very distinct rock feature with a very distinct dead tree in the photos.
And there's a photo of Toni and Harold sitting right where I'm standing.
The lunch spot is a very beautiful spot,
and there's really no reason to go any further. However, they go further. We know that this is the spot that they stopped because there are several photos of Harold Henthorn standing right on that ledge with this death grip on this tree because it's a sheer drop on the other side of him. 15 minutes later, there's another picture of him, identical, but he's wearing a blue denim shirt.
This strikes investigators as odd. Why would Harold stand at the edge of such a dangerous cliff and then do it again 15 minutes later?
This photo, you're actually looking up from where her body was recovered. This is 160 feet. This is where Toni fell.
She had what we call multiple blunt force injuries. She kind of tumbled down the rock face. She had abrasions of her forehead, and she had a large laceration or tearing injury to the top of her head, to the scalp.
When you saw the autopsy report, what did you think?
I was taken aback by the size of her head wound. She probably would have bled out very quickly.
Okay, what's her main injury? Concussion.
Never once did Harold mention in any of the 911 calls that she was bleeding.
And a curious discovery. As rangers go through Harold Henthorn's vehicle, they find a map with markings on it.
What's interesting on this map is there's an X and it says hike.
Yeah, you can see it. It's in that gray right there.
That's almost exactly where her body was found, where that X was. There's a lot of things here that don't add up.
When you look at these pictures, particularly because they're 15 minutes apart, what stands out to you about that?
Our theory was that he was trying to lure her to stand where he is, that he's saying, look, honey, this is safe. You can stand here. One of the things that was very suspicious was Harold's story that they stopped at this cliff ledge and that he received a text message from his nanny saying that his daughter had just won a soccer game and that out of the corner of his eye, he looked up and Toni was gone.
very specific moment in time. And we realized that, well, that text message came in at the same time that he called 911.
911, what's your address, the emergency?
Hello, my name is Harold Henthorne.
He told Mark it took him about 45 minutes to get down to the bottom of the cliff where Tony's body was, and then he called 911. We know when he called 911 and when that text message came in, and those don't match up to his story. He then subsequently starts making more phone calls. He calls Barry Burley, Tony Henthorne's brother. He is a surgeon.
He's sending you, the doctor, vital signs.
Initially, he told me that her heart rate was good and her respiration rate was somewhat low, and that she was not conscious.
Harold never says she's got a massive head wound, never says that she's bleeding out, none of that, just that she fell and is unconscious.
Hey, do you know how to perform CPR?
I do.
Harold said he did CPR from the whole time that the 911 call came in to when the Park Service got there.
In the autopsy photos, her lipstick was intact. I've personally done CPR and it's extremely messy. And you don't end up with intact lipstick like Tony did.
So Harold's texting with Barry while he's allegedly helping his wife, while he's telling people that Tony has fallen from a cliff.
He ended up receiving and sending over 90 texts that night.
I guess it was about 10 o'clock at night. We got a text from Harold. Tony's been hurt. She's critical. Please pray. There was one more text that followed, and it said, "My bride is gone." Just was inconceivable. We just couldn't believe it.
At what point did you find out that your sister had passed?
It was probably about 10:30 Central Time that night.
Who told you? Was it Harold or the Rangers?
Actually, Harold. He had texted.
He texted a lot of people. The same text. My bride is gone.
Almost immediately, family and friends begin to notice Harold behaving in a way they think is strange.
And I thought, wow, he just seemed kind of together for having gone through what he went through.
No tears, no sign that he'd been crying, no, struggling with his voice to get the words out. This is not a normal grieving husband. That's when I felt like something's not right here.
Harold called me and asked me to officiate the memorial service. He had this service entirely planned. He'd already put together a video montage of Tony.
Somehow, in the 36 hours since he was in this cold, dark place next to his dead wife, he's put this together.
It felt like to me that he had been planning this for a while.
In the hours and days after Tony's death, everyone's watching Harold, and he is, for the most part, showing no signs of what you would expect. How can it not put your antenna up?
We arrive in Denver, and the whole time you never saw him cry. He never said, I loved your sister, that never heard any of that kind of thing out of him.
Tony's funeral is the ultimate chance for Harold to kind of control the narrative. And what Harold chooses to do with that moment is pretty telling. Everybody notices, the Burleys especially, where everyone's sitting in the funeral. They're brought in, they're seated away from the rest of the family. Harold is one of the last people escorted in.
We had to literally line up in order to walk back in for Tony's funeral.
It's like we were sequestered, and we could only come out when we were told to come out.
I'm all the way positioned at the back because everything was planned out, just like Harold always does.
He had already had a slideshow ready and prepared.
Everyone experiences some feeling of deep discomfort that this isn't right. And that extends to the slideshow too. because one of the first people Harold contacted the day after Tony died is the photographer to create the slideshow for her funeral. And she's expecting some loose collection of photos over the years, and that's not what she gets. What she gets are 70 carefully selected photos. Somehow, in the 36 hours since he was in this cold, dark place next to his dead wife, he's put this together.
I'm thinking to myself now, if Paula died, I'd be over here in a little puddle of mush. He has all this ready to go, and he's proud of it. The odd thing is that Tony was the one that died, but Harold's got most of the photos in there of him.
Wait, what do you mean?
There would be pictures of him and Haley, or him, Tony and Haley, but not all of them were even about Tony.
It was like Tony's life started when she got married to Harold. And I thought, how insulting and hurtful to Tony's family.
We talked to other people who were at the service, and he didn't say any nice things about Tony, that he was more angry that there was an investigation. And in fact, at one point he said to somebody, Tony had to go and get herself killed on federal lands.
Soon after the funeral, Harold hires an attorney who puts a stop to any more interviews. So investigators turn to friends and family to get more information. And some aren't buying Harold's story about this being an accident.
I talked to the Bertolays several times. They maintained contact with Harold to keep an eye on Haley. They wanted to make sure Haley was okay. But they also were giving me updates on Harold. And they felt that that was a way that they could help in the investigation.
We were taking notes.
How can you keep being around him and not just explode?
I thought that I was helping by doing that. We were making on our part to get justice. He had established a wall there, and so for us to continue to see Haley, we had to see him. And so it was like a price of admission. The real jewel was Haley.
We talked to the nannies. One of the nannies told us that Harold and Tony didn't sleep together, that they had separate areas where they slept. He had an office in his basement, but occasionally he would also go on business trips. And he would go on these trips, but he wouldn't have luggage, and then he would just kind of show up the next day. And the nanny was wondering if Harold was having an affair. He seemed to have a secret life. So, all right, let's find out what we can about his business.
Now, the address for the business was in his basement. But if you talk to him, he would say, I've got 10 to 12 managers reporting to me daily. I've got 90 employees working all over the country.
We thought there was plenty of money. He always portrayed himself as a wealthy person, and we were getting word that they were needing money.
It wasn't just Harold who seemed to be doing well financially. Tony's family had money of their own, money she had access to.
I do remember that Mr. and Miss Bertolay were confused why the money seemed to be missing.
My parents are buying the house, they're buying the car, they're paying for their tuition. That doesn't make sense.
And as investigators start to dig deeper, they make a series of head-scratching discoveries.
We couldn't find any concrete evidence of his work. There was no online presence, and almost everybody has an online presence of some sort if they have a business, especially if you're a fundraiser. On his business cards, Harold had CFR, Certified Fundraiser, and there's actually an agency that issues that certification. So I contacted that agency, and they indicated no. We have no idea who he is, and no, he's not a certified fundraiser. Oh my gosh, he doesn't even have a business.
But that's nothing compared to what they're about to learn. Anonymous tips start pouring in, raising questions about Harold's past.
Most people didn't know that Harold was married before, but I thought, oh my gosh, this is 2 wives for Harold that have died now.
The similarities are too eerie to ignore.
Most people didn't know that Harold was married before and that his first wife had died.
Her name was Lynn Henthorne.
What Harold tells most people is Lynn died in a car accident. And most people aren't going to press.
But I thought, oh my gosh, this is 2 lives for Harold that have died now. Because we had some suspicions that Tony's death was not as Harold was making it sound, I made the phone call to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. I did do it anonymously, and other people had done the same thing.
The coroner in charge of Tony's autopsy, an investigative reporter at a TV station in Denver, the FBI, National Park Service were on the receiving end of what ended up being 17 anonymous letters.
The consistent theme was Harold's first wife died in similar unusual circumstances. You gotta look into it. Remote locations, odd places, why were they there in the first place? Harold was not injured in any way in either of these incidents, but his spouse was killed.
Getting these types of anonymous calls and anonymous letters is unusual. It hasn't happened to me before. I've done about 8,000 cases now. It took me 3 months to get enough of the investigative details together that I felt comfortable filing the death certificate, and I filed it as undetermined. Homicide cannot be entirely excluded. I've never written that kind of a comment before.
What did you learn about Lynn?
Very religious. She and Harold married fairly young, never had any kids. He really wanted a child with Lynn. We also learned that he was very controlling of his relationship with Lynn.
Was the control a red flag for you?
Absolutely, because he drove the relationship.
My first impressions of Harold was he was a outgoing, gregarious salesman type. And I'm being a salesman myself at that time, I was fine with that energy.
Harold is bigger than life. He smiles all the time, he laughs all the time. So when I first met him, I thought, gosh, this is a great guy.
When we were moving quickly towards Lynn's and Harold's wedding, it was clear that Harold was in charge.
So Lynn and Harold got married, but then almost immediately, Harold was saying we need to move to Colorado, so he takes her away.
I called Lynn one day and I said, can we talk? This was a good time for me. And she said, no, can you call back later when Harold's here? And she said, as a couple, we've decided that whenever we talk to family, we want to both be on the phone at the same time.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, again, that's so weird, that's so controlling.
Lynn's sister-in-law, Grace Rochelle, also sensed something was off.
She confided in me, and she said, Grace, I don't know what to do. Like, we're having some marital issues, but he doesn't want me to talk to anyone. He would consider that disloyal. And she didn't know where to go, like what to do.
While family members may have quietly had concerns about Harold and Lynn's relationship, her death is ruled an accident, and it stays that way for years until a local coroner in Colorado takes a second look at the night Lynn died and finds similarities between Lynn's death and Tony's.
Harold claims that he was driving the road and the right front tire seems spongy. So he pulled over to change the tire.
There's two types of jacks involved in this incident. One is a regular car jack. The other jack was a boat jack, which is basically a tube with another telescoping tube that comes out of it. Not safe for a car. His story is that this car jack, this more stable one, didn't work, so he used a boat jack to jack up the car.
So then he said he had taken the lug nuts off of the wheel, and he said that Lynn had a cloth in her hand, and he handed her the lug nuts. He pulled the tire off.
His version was that Lynn must have dropped the lug nuts and gone to crawl under the car to get the lug nuts, because there were lug nuts in the photos of the scene. There were lug nuts under the car.
And then he said he went to the back of the Jeep and he tossed the tire into the back of the Jeep. And that when he did that, it dislodged the Jeep. And he heard a scream, and he said he ran to the front of the vehicle and he could see that the vehicle had dropped and was laying on his wife.
As the coroner reviews the 1995 death of Lynn Henthorne, Beth Schott decides to double down and enlist Dave Weaver, an investigator with the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, to also take a second look.
I was given the Lynn Henthorne case to reinvestigate in January of 2013. I discovered in the documentation one of the first witnesses on scene. When I called her up, I said, "Can you think of any reason why a detective from Douglas County would want to call you and talk to you?" And her response to me was, "That lady, I still have nightmares about that."
The woman on the phone, Patricia Montoya. In detail, Montoya remembers that late evening drive in 1995 like it happened yesterday.
There's a man standing in the middle of the road with a flasher. We pulled over, and he told us that there was an accident, that they had a flat, and his wife got stuck under the car. We could see, some legs, coming out from the bottom of the car. We all got out of the truck, and we got her out of the car from underneath the car. And we were gently turning her over because she was on her stomach. We're doing the CPR, and her husband came over and he started screaming at us. "Don't touch her. Leave her alone." You could hear the sirens coming. And that's when the guys started asking him, "How did she get underneath that car?" And when he heard the sirens coming, the look on his face was like in a panic, more of a panic, instead of gladness, that there's help coming for my wife. It was creepier than ever. There's no way that that was an accident.
Could the Jeep have fallen off the jack accidentally?
Let's try this now.
A recreation puts Harold's version of events to the test.
Nothing. So let me put a little pressure this way. Nothing.
You can't replicate it the way he says it happened.
Oh!
We were trying to pull in elements of Lynn's death into our case.
Laura Thomas is the coroner in Douglas County, and she has a lot of questions about Lynn's death. So much so that she hires someone to reconstruct the accident that took Lynn.
Accident reconstruction is sort of like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. You take the pieces of information and factual information and try to put them together to see if they fit. Where was the vehicle positioned? What's the terrain look like? You look at the gravel surface that this Jeep was parked on.
When Dave Weaver was assigned to the case, he opened it up as a possible homicide, and he was looking at it as, is that even physically possible for someone to crawl under a car to get lug nuts and then have this jack collapse?
We're going to replicate with this exemplar vehicle the layout of all the physical evidence. That includes the lug nuts, the positioning of the bottle jacks, and then hopefully also replicate the vehicle's movement off of the bottle jacks. It'd be, yeah, there you go.
Is that about right?
Yeah.
Going by Harold's story, they try to recreate what he says happened that night.
So
One of the versions that Harold gave, Lynn's here 6 feet away from the Jeep. He takes the tire, he walks to the back, puts the tire in the back. Whatever he did caused the Jeep to fall off the jack.
But look at the time interval. From the time he picks up the flat tire, goes roughly 12 feet to the back corner.
Yes.
To put the tire in, she moves closer to the vehicle, then drops the lug nuts, allegedly, and then gets down on her stomach and crawls up underneath. So, I mean, that timing just doesn't make sense because it would take more time, I believe, for her to do all of those activities than it would for him to come around and put the tire in the back of the Jeep.
No logical person would crawl under a rotor.
The other inconsistency is both the medical people as well as the coroner's office, when they did the autopsy, there was nothing in her fingernails, there was nothing on her hands indicating that she was struggling.
If I was Harold, who allegedly had a bad back, you wouldn't just pick the tire up and throw it in, but that's what he said he did, right? So I'm gonna pick the tire up, which is pretty heavy, and I'm gonna throw it in. Okay. Didn't do anything, didn't knock it off. Realistically, if you were gonna put a tire in a jacked up car, you probably wouldn't throw it in. You'd probably place it in. Nothing. So let me put a little pressure this way. Nothing.
If it wasn't the tire being placed or thrown into the vehicle that caused the Jeep to fall off the jack, what or who did?
Let's try this now.
Lowering the bottle jack.
Oh!
That's it.
That's it.
That makes a lot more
Yeah.
sense. That's something Harold could control.
You can't replicate it the way he says it happened.
Our conclusion is Harold could have actually released that bottle jack, and it could have lowered directly onto her very rapidly. Releasing it down is the most controlled.
Harold Henthorne's attorney says the simulation doesn't prove anything.
We're not proving that Harold killed Lynn, but we wanted to introduce Lynn Henthorne's death into our case of Tony's as a precursor to killing Tony.
Harold Henthorne maintains that he did not kill either of his wives.
When Laura Thomas got our report and finished her investigation, she changed the official cause of death from accidental to indeterminate on the death certificate and reissued that.
The official change on the death certificate doesn't change anything for Harold. He simply continues on with his life. He's not charged in Lynn's death, and the case is eventually closed.
What was really important to me was for Lynn's family to know that the death certificate had been changed. So they would know that Lynn was still remembered and that she wasn't forgotten.
In fact, even after Lynn's death, Harold Henthorne stays close to her family, especially Lynn's sister-in-law, Grace Rochelle.
I felt like my relationship with Harold got closer.
I had gotten cell records, and one of the individuals that kept popping up in the cell record was Grace Rochelle.
Hi, Grace, it's Harold calling. Call back to the
Harold and Grace texted and called each other all the time before Tony died. And we had to ask the question, was Grace his paramour? Is this why he killed Tony?
And Harold's daughter says his need to be in control continues.
That moment was horrible. And right after, he didn't want me to cry about it. He told me not to cry. He told me that people would be watching.
I thought, oh my gosh, this is two wives for Harold that have died now.
Has some really eerie similarities.
One is under a car in the middle of the night, and then Tony was on the edge of a dangerous cliff.
The last thing that Tony ever had going through her mind was him pushing her off.
Do you think he targeted Tony from the very beginning?
Absolutely.
All right, Tony's next. Yeah. Okay.
He had the person that he could control 1,000% above any wife or anyone else in his life, and that was his daughter.
So at this point, are you worried about Haley's safety?
The last thing he wanted was him going home to his child.
I thought there must have been some mistake because he would never do that, right?
I definitely felt that I could have been the third victim. I'm like, oh my gosh.
I believe that the closer you are to Harold, the more likely that he's going to harm or kill you.
Within days of Tony dying, the park received a letter about Harold's first wife, Lynn Henthorne.
Harold's first wife, Lynn, died when she was crushed under a car during a roadside tire change. Authorities deemed it an accident. But when his second wife, Tony, falls to her death in Rocky Mountain National Park, investigators aren't convinced that fall is just another random accident.
A man having one wife die is tragic. A man having two wives die is suspicious. So we started questioning, did he have a mistress? Did he have another family somewhere?
I've seriously thought that there may be somebody else involved in this.
At that point, I had gotten cell records, and one of the individuals that kept popping up in a cell record was Grace Rochelle.
So Grace Rochelle was Harold's former sister-in-law.
Lynn Rochelle, his first wife's brother's ex-wife.
Harold's relationship with Grace Rochelle and her 4 daughters starts off as totally understandable, with Harold being a more doting uncle and brother-in-law than just about anybody you'd ever meet.
But Harold and Grace texted and called each other all the time. We had to ask the question,
Was Grace Harold's lover?
is this why he killed Tony?
They were very suspicious of me. And I'm like, I am an open book, and I will tell you everything I know. I was not romantically involved with Harold. In December of 2007, my husband, Kevin, and I separated, so that was hard. That was difficult. We went through bankruptcy, foreclosure. I was devastated. I did not want my marriage to end. I had no savings, no nothing at that point. And I thought of my girls.
Harold saw, I believe, an exact way to fit in and bond with 4 girls, which was the fun, goofy uncle.
Harold really began to step it up. He's giving me all this mentoring budget advice, and he says, Tony and I we just want to help you.
Grace sat with us for 5 hours and talked with us. We pretty quickly determined that she was not Harold's paramour. Grace was concerned about her children's financial future, and Harold said, I tell you what, why don't you get in an insurance policy and we'll make the girls a beneficiary.
At first, the insurance policy seemed like a gracious gift that I could accept because it was for my girls.
Yeah, there's that one. This is one of the things he would do is like, the fun uncle.
There's an odd sense of, like we were the family that maybe Harold always wanted.
There's another Christmas one where he just looks like it's just
always looks like our dad.
So in about March of 2010, the divorce was final, and I'm gonna move to Texas. And Harold and I got into basically a big fight about it. And Harold was trying to get us to come to Colorado. He gets really mad at me. He came back at me with, after all I've spent investing in you, and you're not grateful. I I saw him as being very controlling at a whole new level. So I called his broker and I said, I am not going through with this policy. No way. I'm done.
And then we dropped the bomb on her that Harold never canceled this policy. The policy had Harold Henthorne as the primary beneficiary. Her daughters weren't mentioned at all. And the policy was $400,000.
I said, that can't be possible. I told him to cancel it. That was done. She said it's paid through till August of this year. I was just shocked. I definitely felt that I could have been the third victim. I'm like, oh my gosh, what have I done? How have I not seen through this guy?
According to investigators, it isn't just Grace Rochelle's insurance that is set up to benefit Harold. You actually found a pattern of this.
Correct. When we looked at Lynn's death, we found there was $600,000 that he received. But then we saw over time that Harold had taken out several policies also on Tony that nobody seemed to know about. The year that they're married, he takes out a $1.5 million policy on Tony. Then he takes out another $1.5 million policy in 2005. In 2008, takes out yet another $1.5 million. So we're seeing this pattern of building up her net worth, so to speak, if she were to die.
At the time she died, how much was she worth dead?
She was worth dead $4.7 million.
This pattern with the insurance isn't the only one that stands out to investigators. It looks to them like Harold set his sights on a very specific type of woman to marry.
Both women were described as extremely loving Christian women, successful, strong women, but at the same time, very controlled by Harold.
One of the things that Tony's personal experience with Christianity taught her was that women are to look to their husbands as the authority in a marriage. That control is exactly what Harold was after.
Do you think he targeted Tony from the very beginning?
Absolutely. I think that he was preying on and utilizing Christian ideals to manipulate people.
After Tony moved to Colorado, Harold started controlling her communication with the family.
When I would call out there, he would answer the phone.
Did you see a change in your sister?
When she moves to Colorado, she's in the shadows. And she's now a different person. She's a trained person. She's almost like a beaten dog.
We started seeing things being taken from her, one painful step at a time. She dropped out of her choir that she loved. She quit teaching Sunday school. He had asked her to give that up because it was taking away from their marriage.
Tony's next. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Merry Christmas. Tony and I flew in last evening from Denver, Colorado.
I later found out from the neighbors, they said her face was empty. She didn't smile. It was kind of like a blank stare.
Tony's mother said this wasn't the first time something bad happened to Tony.
It looked like a freak accident.
Is it possible that Harold Henthorne had tried but failed to kill Tony before?
The Henthornes had a cabin up at Grand Lake. They had been up at the cabin, and it was late at night.
Nobody else is around. Haley's already asleep. And Harold, for whatever reason, wants to clean up outside, almost in the middle of the night.
It's a small one-story cabin with a fairly sizable deck that goes to a sloping area. There's a broken light. Harold was outside on the deck, and he called Tony to come help him.
And she was bending over to pick it up.
And what happens next, nobody really knows for sure.
Something hits her in the back of the neck.
Her story to the medic is that there was a broken light and she was picking up the broken light bulb when her husband threw a piece of wood over the deck.
It looked like a freak accident.
We found out later that, Tony's actually crying in the ambulance on the way over. And she said, well, what really happened to me?
The final outcome was that she suffered damage to her cervical spine.
I really believe that was his first attempt at murder.
There's no police report, right? There's no crime.
As an investigator, you're looking at this, you're like, what else is he capable of? And that's what we really needed to dive into. So we needed to do a presentation to the United States Attorney's Office to see who we could get assigned to the case. And it was at that time that we got assigned Sunita and Valeria. And I said, look, you guys need to come up to Rocky Mountain National Park and see the scene. So we hike up Deer Mountain, and then we start going off trail. And they're like, wait a minute.
We just turned off at nowhere. There was no indication that there was a spot to turn off.
His story that he told the Rangers is they went off to have some romantic time.
There's just no way. We knew Tony Henthorne had bad knees. It just didn't make sense.
And then we wander through the woods, and then we get to the lunch spot. And they had the aha moment. They looked down that rocky slope, and they said there's no reason for Harold and Tony to be here.
And as soon as Sunita and I saw the site, we were totally on board with them and said, okay, we're in 100%. What are we going to do to prove this case now?
And so we realized we were going to have to do a search warrant for his house.
What Harold was a pack rat. And so every single piece of paper from the last 20 years was in there.
The boat, the cabin, how much is in this account, that account. There were tax returns, which were very interesting to us.
I'm a fundraising consultant. I work with nonprofits, whether it be churches, schools, or hospitals.
Over the course of 20 years, not only has he not set the world on fire,
I live in the suburb of Las Vegas as well.
but Harold made almost nothing for 2 decades. Almost $0.
He had posed for almost 20 years as somebody he's not and worked really hard at it.
I reached out to Special Agent Johnny Grusing of the FBI and asked him if he would jump in and assist and work with Beth.
If Harold truly killed not only Tony, but his first wife, Lynn, and we had him still running around in society, we needed to act quickly.
What'd you see?
Friends and family told us that once Tony had Haley, it was almost like Tony was a third wheel in that family.
He had the person that he could control 1,000% above any wife or anyone else in his life, and that was his daughter.
So we all felt like we were dealing with a ticking time bomb.
So that has some really eerie similarities. The information that we did piece together from his childhood was little bits and pieces from friends that did speak with us.
My name is Myra Whitener, and I went to junior high school with Harold. We remained friends throughout our whole lives. For all of us, honestly, he was obnoxious, but you just kind of overlooked that because he was so charming too.
Casting around for ideas of why Harold is who he is, and I think it all comes down to his dad. He was an alcoholic. He was violent. It was bad.
That's one thing Harold always said, I will never drink, and I will never hit a woman, he said. which is why it's shocking. Well, Harold always wanted to have a family. He wanted to be a family man.
If you're going to be a good predator, if you're going to be a good wolf in sheep's clothing, you have to look like a sheep. Harold had to condition himself to show emotion.
And he's all about presentation. He needed everybody to know how smart and how powerful and how rich he was.
He has lied to me about everything.
He lied so much that he forgot who he lied to.
I think Harold is different than most psychopaths because he's not someone who's going to hurt a stranger. He's fine to strangers. But I believe that the closer you are to Harold, the more likelihood that he's going to harm or kill you.
So at this point, are you worried about Haley's safety?
Yeah, we were very concerned about Haley. He wasn't treating her like a dad should treat his daughter. He was controlling her in a very unhealthy way.
But it's Haley who is in control now, and she's talking exclusively to 2020.
My name is Haley Bertollet. I'm ready now to tell the story that happened behind the scenes.
Haley Bertollet was just 7 years old when her mother, Tony, died.
You've never told your story before.
I haven't.
She sat down with me to tell her story for the first time.
We love you.
Oh, we love you.
I remember my mom. She was amazing. She was so intelligent and so wise and eloquent. You know, we always watched like movies together and we played together, and I remember her taking me on trips sometimes, and I remember her always being a warm and loving presence in my life. I just really, really loved her.
When you think about what your house was like when you were little growing up, do you have any memories of what the interactions between your mother and your biological father were like?
Yes. All of the memories that I have of me and my mom together with Harold were I was always with him and she was separate. He was always holding me and she was standing there. The only times that I really got to experience my mom in her full capacity was when he was away. All she ever wanted was a baby, and when she finally got me, she just was ecstatic, and I think he wanted to squeeze her into a box.
I see.
Not really let her be the mother that she wanted to be for me.
Do you remember your parents' anniversary that day that they went on that surprise trip?
I was at a soccer game, and I remember I was picked up by his friends, and we went to their house, and I definitely knew that something was wrong. Everyone was acting so weird to me, and I didn't know what was happening. And after a while, they took me to a park where I met up with Harold. He sat me down, and he told me that she had lost consciousness forever, is how he put it to me. And I just remember that moment was horrible. And right after, he didn't want me to cry about it. He told me not to cry. He told me that people would be watching.
He told you not to cry?
He told me not to cry about it, yes. As we walked out of the park, he wanted me to be fine. I remember feeling shameful that like I wasn't supposed to cry, like something must be wrong with me if I do cry, because Harold told me not to.
Did you realize at that point that your mother was dead?
Yes, but for some reason I thought she was coming back because of the way he phrased it, unconscious. You know, in my mind, I thought that she might just be out there somewhere and maybe they hadn't found her yet. And I'd pray at night that she would come back.
What was the point that you realized that she was gone?
We had one funeral in Colorado and one in Mississippi, and that time was the time that I really felt like, you know, oh man, she's really gone.
I know he told you you shouldn't cry, but were there moments that you cried?
I mean, when I usually was alone, when he wasn't there, it was just a lot. And I didn't understand that it was okay to be emotional, and it was okay to show that you're not okay. I mean, I don't think anybody normal is okay after the passing of their mom, and I certainly wasn't.
Did he ever talk about your mom after all of this happened?
He never talked to me about her passing after that one conversation in the park. We never spoke about her.
In the days, in the months after, what was it like in your house, just you and Harold?
He definitely wanted to keep me acting normal. Like, everything that we were up to was just as life was before, except now my mom wasn't there.
I just want to show you this picture. Do you remember this?
I don't remember taking this, but it looks like this was right after the funeral.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at for me, just kind of like looking at your hands. You look like you're clenching your fists.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely could be some of the subconscious tension, you know.
He's holding you in this picture. Do you feel like he ever used you as like a prop?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely,
How
yes.
often did he actually hold you like this?
Not ever when we were alone. I can't remember a time that he ever hugged me if it was not in public.
Really?
Yeah. Looking at that picture, I can't imagine that that wasn't staged.
Did you feel like Harold was controlling you?
Not in the moment. I mean, I thought that was normal. I thought that's what all parents did for their kids. And I couldn't get like food or snacks or water for myself without like asking for permission. I couldn't play with my toys without asking for permission. He had to be there when I was playing with my toys.
You couldn't get like food or
No,
water?
I couldn't leave my room. And he had a baby monitor in my room watching me. And so he would know if I came downstairs to get anything before he said it was allowable. When he did allow me to socialize with other girls my age, it was always in a very strict setting where he could watch. I never spent probably an hour without him during my daytime, if it was a Saturday or a Sunday.
Were you scared of Harold?
Absolutely. And I thought that was normal to be scared of your parents too.
We were concerned that his relationship with Haley was almost to a point of obsession.
We thought, really, he's a danger.
We were literally on bated breath. What's he going to do with her?
So Harold knew that we were investigating him, and he had told people that he had a bag packed for when he got arrested.
2 years after Tony died, federal authorities finally have enough evidence to arrest Harold for her murder.
We needed to indict him pretty quickly. Harold was starting to move money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, so that elevated our concern.
We thought, really, he's a danger. This man has killed supposedly 2 wives, and the last thing we wanted was him going home to his child.
By now, the Burleys say 9-year-old Haley is being isolated from the rest of her family, and she's completely under Harold's control.
Our primary concern when we arrested Harold was that he was going to create some sort of hostage or dangerous situation with Haley if he knew his freedom was at risk. So we had FBI agents watch his routine from when he woke up to when he took her to the church, school, and then when he went back home. So when we got the warrant, we knew exactly what he was going to do.
So you really did think she was in danger?
Yeah, we did.
A Highlands ranch man already being investigated for murdering his first wife, arrested today accused of murdering his second wife.
2 years after her death, her husband Harold is in federal custody, charged with first-degree murder.
The day that he got arrested, I was at school, and I remember that I got called down to the principal's office. At that point, my principal and the lady that worked in the office told me that my father had been arrested. I just remember feeling just so cold and detached because I didn't know what was going on and I didn't know what was happening to me. And at this point, I thought there must have been some mistake because he would never do that, right?
At a bond hearing the following week, a judge denies Harold bail, declaring him a substantial flight risk.
I stayed with a lovely family called the Heddicks, and they helped me to see that he was not the person that I thought he was.
According to the indictment, Harold willfully, deliberately, maliciously killed his wife, Toni. Harold pleads not guilty.
Little did I know that in the background, people were fighting for me from all over. From Mississippi, my family, the Bertolets, were fighting for me. Beth Schott, special agent, was fighting for me.
The thing both family and investigators are most worried about, a not guilty verdict would put Haley back in the hands of a man they are certain is a cold-blooded killer.
My superiors were wondering if we should strike some sort of deal with Harold ahead of time just because everybody's primary concern was Haley.
With Haley's safety weighing on them, prosecutors begin building their case against Harold.
Harold turns out to be a not very nice person. That doesn't mean you murdered your wife.
Toni was set to inherit a lot of money. She was set for life. She knew it, they knew it, and certainly Harold knew it.
Toni Henthorne got regular royalty checks from her family because they're in the oil industry.
These checks that Toni would get for oil and gas, Harold would deposit them. And at one point, Toni's father found out that all of the oil and gas checks went into Harold's account. And he confronted Toni with it. He's like, why don't you have your own account? Why don't you separate your finances from Harold? And that spurred Toni to open up her own bank account. And she actually took the next checks and she deposited them. Harold was not on that account.
I thought to myself, she's about to leave him.
Our theory is that Toni was starting to pull away from him. And if Toni were to ever leave him, it would all come out financially, that he didn't have a job, that he had been lying, and that he would probably lose custody of Haley. And we think that that would have been absolutely unacceptable for Harold. And we think that was the motivating factor to kill her then.
The money.
The money and control.
Motive started solidifying pretty quickly.
But prosecutors know they need more than motive. They have to be able to convince 12 jurors that Toni's death was no accident, that her fall was carefully planned and executed.
I had a big pile of cell tower information as well as call information, and I gave that pile to Johnny. I said, try to figure out where Harold was going on these business trips.
I think he had laid a trap for Toni, and he was committed now to carrying that through.
He'd found a spot.
He'd found a spot.
Hello, my name is Harold Henthorne. I'm in the Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okay.
My wife has fallen from a rock.
Beth Schott discovered a mountain of cell tower data linked to Harold's cell phone.
So when you're using your cell phone, it is pinging off the local tower, so we can find where your phone has been on given dates and times.
Once I saw him using that tower, I'm like, that planning goes back over a month and a half before her death. Everything else made sense from this because how Harold knew the location when he called 911, how he had geo coordinates, how he would know he even had cell service there, how he knew that there was a cliff there.
It started once Harold figured out Toni had opened up her own bank account.
On September 9th, he spent from 10:30 a.m. to almost 9 p.m. in the park, 11 hours up there. I think this is when he found his spot. On the way back is when he started calling Toni's eye clinic. He started arranging everything for this anniversary trip.
After this trip.
After this trip. He wanted an isolated spot where nobody would be there to save Toni. And then here's where he starts making the calls to set everything in motion.
We had to strategize on what circumstantial evidence would be key to our investigation.
Why is it that circumstantial evidence is so tricky for jurors?
Well, people want direct evidence, right? They want to see that it's an absolute. In a homicide case, it's even harder to show a jury circumstantial evidence and have them come to the conclusion of homicide.
The planning that Harold put into this, you're not going to have a smoking gun. But that planning and premeditation points towards intent, which points towards first-degree homicide.
Harold hires an attorney named Craig Truman.
He's a very well-respected criminal defense attorney in town who has decades of experience.
I think Harold's lawyer strategy is to figure out what our case is and where he can poke holes in it.
One of the things that we did legally was to make a decision that we were going to try and use the 1995 death of Lynn Henthorne in the case. And in our case, it was to show that this was not an accident.
To tie Lynn's death to Tony's death, we needed to show that they were similar in a variety of ways. Harold had a lot to gain financially because of the insurance money. One is under a car in the middle of the night. Tony was under a deck in the middle of the night when the beam fell on her head. And then Tony was on the edge of a dangerous cliff.
We went to the pretrial very concerned that the evidence was not going to be allowed in.
We were not proving that Lynn was murdered. They could only use it for the limited purpose to show that it was not likely that Tony's death was an accident based on the similarities of Lynn's death.
The judge agreed that yes, Lynn's death and the beam incident, the similarities are too strong to be ignored.
We expect opening statements today in the trial against a Highlands Ranch man accused of pushing his wife off of a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park.
3 years after Tony died, Harold Henthorne now sits in front of a jury of his peers who will decide, based on the evidence, did she fall or did he push her off that cliff?
You know, this is it. There's no go-backs.
We knew we needed to start strong.
We showed the autopsy photos of Tony because he never mentions she's got a massive head wound and that she's bleeding out profusely. And so we wanted to ensure that the jury understood that there's no way he could mistake the injuries.
So Harold's lawyer recognized that you couldn't explain away all of Henthorne's quirks. He sort of embraced him and said, sure, he might be quirky, but that doesn't make him a murderer. Truman's strategy in general was to try to make Lynn's death seem very innocent. Law enforcement closed the case within a week, so this is a big nothing.
He kept saying, no need to look at this again. This poor man has lost 2 wives. How heartbreaking could that be? Harold, he's smiling at his friends, and enough of a narcissist that it's all about him. Because we couldn't bring the jury to the scene, we instead brought the scene to them.
What I think had a big impact on the jurors was having about 2 or 3 park rangers talk them through how difficult it was to get up there and then how dangerous it was to be there.
We're looking at the jurors' faces, and they had the aha moment.
So prosecutors rest their case. Now, it's the defense's turn to argue for Harold's innocence.
Craig Truman didn't bring in any witnesses. He just cross-examined.
The prosecution gets 2 closes. I did the first close, and Valeria did what's called a rebuttal.
I will never forget Sunita saying, this is the man that is supposed to guard and protect his wife. And the last thing that Tony ever had going through her mind was him pushing her off.
In closing arguments, defense attorney Craig Truman says the government has not met their burden. They have not proven that Tony was murdered.
Truman really hammered home that you can't tell the difference between a fall from a push. So after closing arguments, the case goes to the jury.
I felt like we made the case, but there's still a lot of anticipation, a lot of, oh my gosh, I don't know.
You sit down and you think, I hope we did it. It's a lot tougher than you think to get a jury to agree.
And developing right now, the fate of Harold Henthorne is now in the hands of the jury.
You're always nervous about what 12 people are thinking. You just don't know.
And the judge reads the verdict. In the matter of the United States versus Harold Henthorne, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. There was like audible whoops of joy that came out of the courtroom.
I was just so happy.
Just elation. All of this is to get justice for Tony, justice for Haley. And it's a really, really satisfying moment.
The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Harold Henthorne was not charged in connection with Lynn's death. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office says that case is considered closed.
I believe that putting Harold in a position where he cannot control anything is great punishment for Harold. He robbed Haley of a mother.
The sea is cold. We love you. Oh, we love you.
That day was a really good day because I knew that I'd be going to live with my aunt and uncle.
My brother and sister-in-law adopted Haley.
At that point, I felt like they were my family and that I belonged with them in Mississippi.
When Haley came to us, she was almost afraid to do anything without permission. So it took her a while to figure that out, but it didn't take her long at all to, I think, attach. You know, I think she was hungry for a loving parent.
Have you spoken to Harold at all?
Nope. Not at all, and I don't regret that decision.
Were you worried yourself at any point that maybe there's a part of him that's in me?
Maybe, but ultimately no. Because I know that I'm saved by Jesus Christ and that my personality comes from my mom. I'm just like her. And I know that no part of him is in me.
She is a mirror image of her mama.
I do dye my hair blonde, but I think that me and her in pictures that I see of me now, you know, I feel like I look so much like her. And I think that choosing every day to forgive Harold for what he did, not for his sake, but for mine, so that I know that I'm freed from him, from his control, that I'm my own person, and that I'm grounded to do whatever I want to outside of his control.
It's so crazy to hear you say those words. Do you forgive him?
I do, yeah.
Haley gives herself the gift of forgiveness, and so she can lead the life that Tony wants her to have.
Because if she doesn't forgive him, he still controls her in her heart.
Is there ever things that you wish you could say to your mom?
All the time, but I think that she is here with me. Being who I am is not something that came from easiness. You know, I had to go through something terrible to become as powerful as I am today. I want to use my story to good because I know that my story is similar to what happens to a lot of people, and I want them to know that regardless of what they've been through, there's always a way out of the darkness. And everything that I am, everything that I do, I want to do for the glory of God and for the legacy of my mom.
It was a cold April night in Berlin.
The kind of night where the air smells like metal and silence hums behind every streetlight. At 11:47 p.m., a surveillance camera outside a convenience store caught the last known image of her. A young woman walking alone under the yellow light, her hair wet from drizzle, her backpack clutched close to her chest. Her name was Lena Hoffman, a 22-year-old architecture student at the Technical University. She vanished into the dark and never came back. For 20 years, her name echoed like a ghost through the city. Every anniversary candles appeared at the corner of Weidenweg and Motorsonnenstrasse, but no one ever saw her again, until now. The case was reopened in 2023 after a construction crew discovered a rusted bicycle buried beneath a parking lot near Friedrichshain. It was the same model Lena rode that night, and taped under the seat was a small sealed notebook, a diary. The pages were soaked edges torn, but the ink still bled words that would rewrite the entire case. Police forensics confirmed the handwriting. It was Lena's. Inside were fragments, notes about someone following her cryptic sketches of the same street corner drawn over and over, and a chilling line written 3 days before she disappeared. "He knows I'm leaving." Investigators had to name Heinrich Stahl Lena's professor and mentor. In 2003, he was questioned once, briefly. He had no alibi, but also no evidence against him. The case went cold. Back then, Berlin was different, a city still half-haunted by its divided past. Nightclubs opened in abandoned factories, and students like Lena wandered the streets after midnight chasing art and freedom. The line between creativity and chaos was thin. The diary changed everything. The entries revealed a hidden relationship between Lena and her professor, something that had been erased from official records. The police went back to Stahl, now 63, living quietly in Potsdam, retired teaching art classes for children. He denied everything. But DNA evidence from the notebook's cover, a trace of skin cells, matched his. That was enough to bring him in. Still, what haunted detectives wasn't the science. It was the story told inside the diary. Lena had been documenting something for months, subtle signs she was being watched. Pages described the sound of footsteps behind her, strange phone calls that ended in static, and an envelope left at her dorm door containing a single photo, her sitting at a cafe, unaware. Investigators reopened every file, every statement. Witnesses who'd long moved away were called again. One woman, now living in Hamburg, remembered seeing Lena arguing with a man near a tram stop 2 nights before she vanished. She thought it was just a lover's quarrel. No one followed up back then. The old case files showed sloppy work officers, overworked evidence, mislabeled key photos missing. But the diary added context, a pattern. Every fear Lena described matched a real event logged in police reports: break-ins near her street, a stalker who targeted women on bicycles, phone harassment around campus. Yet none of it was ever connected. Until one forensics officer, a young recruit, cross-referenced the handwriting with a forgotten file from 2004, a suicide note written by another student of Professor Stahl, a girl named Clara Voigt, who'd taken her own life a year after Lena disappeared. Her handwriting matched Lena's diary style eerily. Both shared similar phrasing, even identical sketches of a faceless figure with hollow eyes. The connection chilled everyone. If Lena's diary was authentic, and if Clara's note was more than a suicide confession, it meant someone had manipulated both women. The pattern hinted at a predator who thrived on control. And the diary's final entry deepened the mystery. "If anything happens, don't believe what they say about me." He writes too. Investigators tore through every old case file from the university's art and architecture departments. They found a disturbing record of disappearances and accidents linked to students in Stahl's classes. None were ever considered criminal until now. In the press, the story exploded. Berlin 2003 cold case solved missing students' diary changes everything. News anchors repeated the headline every hour. The public devoured it. But behind the scenes, detectives knew they were barely scratching the surface. The diary wasn't just a confession, it was bait. Several pages were written in code, a mix of architectural sketches and coordinates. When plotted, they pointed not to her university or her home, but to an abandoned printing warehouse near Ostkreuz. Police searched the site, peeling layers of dust off forgotten machines. In a locked cabinet, they found film rolls dated April 2003. Developed, they revealed dozens of candid photos Lena at cafes at class, waiting at crosswalks. Someone had been documenting her life in secret. One frame stood out her reflection in a glass door, and behind her, blurred but distinct, a man's silhouette holding a camera. It wasn't Stahl. The face, when enhanced, matched another name buried in old records, Felix Merton, a freelance photographer who worked with the university on student exhibitions. He disappeared in 2004, officially listed as having left for Argentina, except he never boarded that flight. Interpol found no record of his passport used anywhere. For 2 decades, his name gathered dust. Now he was the ghost in every photo. Investigators realized what they were dealing with wasn't a single act of obsession, but a network of silence professors, assistants, artists, all protecting each other, all complicit in the disappearance. Lena's diary was her attempt to expose it. Her final entries were frantic, written in shaking handwriting. "I'm going to meet him tonight. If he doesn't show up, I'll go to the police. If I don't come back, the truth is in the warehouse." That night, April 3rd, 2003, she vanished. No body, no struggle, just a missing bike and a silent street. For years, it was dismissed as another case of a runaway student, until her diary surfaced. Now, 20 years later, the truth is leaking through the cracks. The city that forgot her name is whispering it again. Lena Hoffmann, the girl who vanished into Berlin's rain, is speaking from the grave through pages that refuse to stay silent, and the ones who watched her disappear. They're finally being watched back. The interrogation room was quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent light. Across the table sat Professor Heinrich Stahl, calm, meticulous, the kind of man who seemed carved out of composure. His fingers tapped in slow rhythm against the metal surface. Detectives Richter and Vogt watched him closely, waiting for a slip, a twitch, a fracture in that calm facade. The evidence was damning, but incomplete. DNA on the diary cover a connection to a former student's suicide and a series of coded sketches pointing to a warehouse full of photographs. Yet when asked about Lena Hoffmann, Stahl's eyes didn't flinch. He said he remembered her as a talented but troubled girl, fascinated by patterns and paranoia. He spoke as if she were an abstract project, not a person. But when they showed him the photographs, those eerie, candid shots of Lena, unaware, his hand froze mid-tap. That single hesitation said more than any confession could. For the first time, he asked for water. Outside, the media storm raged. Every outlet ran the story. Every commentator speculated about obsession power and artistic madness. The professor and the missing student became the new headline. Crowds gathered at the old campus, placing flowers, candles, notes of anger. Yet the deeper investigators went, the more the story twisted. Forensics confirmed that while Stahl's DNA was on the diary, the camera equipment in the warehouse bore fingerprints from multiple people, not just his. Among them, a partial match to the vanished photographer, Felix Merton. The question was, how were they connected? Old university archives revealed a chilling detail. In 2002, Stahl and Merton had collaborated on a controversial photography exhibit titled Still Life, the Human Subject. The project involved candid images of students, taken without their consent, later recontextualized as art exploring voyeurism. It was shut down after backlash, and most of the negatives were destroyed. Or so they thought. The ones in the warehouse were from the same series. Merton had kept everything. The diary's coordinates hadn't just led police to a forgotten space. They had led to a secret gallery preserved in dust and silence for 2 decades. One of the film rolls, when analyzed, contained not photographs, but microfilm documents, copies of letters, grading reports, and what appeared to be correspondence between Stahl and a university administrator. The tone was conspiratorial. They discussed managing the fallout and ensuring there's no link to the program. The administrator had since died in 2011. His name, Klaus Dittmann. He'd been the head of faculty when Lena vanished. The puzzle was growing wider, darker. Detective Richter, who had taken over the cold case division only 2 years earlier, became obsessed. He spent nights reading Lena's diary aloud in his office, tracing her final days like a ritual. He found patterns others missed, recurring phrases that mirrored architectural blueprints, references to angles, light perspective. Lena wasn't just writing, she was encoding. Each sketch in her diary corresponded to a map of Berlin, and within those sketches, hidden coordinates revealed locations tied to Merton's photo archives. One of them pointed to an underground tunnel near the Spree River, sealed off after flooding in 2005. A search team went down there with flashlights and respirators. The air was thick stale. Graffiti covered the walls, initials, dates, faces drawn in dripping paint. Then they found a rusted camera tripod cemented into the mud aimed at a collapsed section of wall. It had been filming something. The memory card inside was corroded, unreadable. But forensic reconstruction recovered fragments of a video blurred. Figures a woman's voice whispering, "Are you recording?" and the sound of running water. In the final frame, a flash of red, a jacket matching the one Lena wore the night she disappeared. The footage was time-stamped April 3, 2003, 23:51, 8 minutes after she was last seen alive. For Richter, it was the closest thing to a ghost reaching out. But something didn't fit. Stahl couldn't have been in two places at once. Witnesses confirmed he'd attended a faculty dinner that night until midnight. The timeline fractured again. Maybe the professor hadn't killed her. Maybe he'd orchestrated something worse. When confronted with the video evidence, Stahl didn't deny its existence. He smiled. "Art," he said quietly. "Always misunderstood." That smile ignited fury. Vogt slammed her hand on the table, demanding to know where Felix Merton was. Stahl leaned back, unbothered. "You won't find him," he whispered. "He found her." The words crawled through the room like smoke. That night, detectives raided Merton's old apartment building, now converted into student housing. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found boxes filled with photographs and personal items. IDs, notebooks, even pieces of jewelry belonging to multiple women, reported missing between 1999 and 2004. Berlin's forgotten daughters, all trapped in dusty evidence. The same signature appeared on many envelopes, FM. Merton had been documenting more than art. He'd been collecting lives. Yet in the pile of relics, one object stood out: a Polaroid camera, freshly wiped clean, with a note taped inside the battery compartment: "Truth is in the frame." Forensics traced the last fingerprint on the camera, not to Merton or Stahl, but to someone still alive, Eric Stahl Heinrich's son. A revelation no one saw coming. Eric had been 19 in 2003, a student in the same university working part-time under Merton as a photography assistant. His name had never appeared in the old files. He'd left Germany in 2006 and resurfaced only once in Argentina, the same country Merton was supposedly headed to. Now, 20 years later, the pattern emerged. Father, mentor, assistant, a triad of obsession. The diary's cryptic line he writes to might not have been about the professor at all. It could have been about his son. Interpol traced Eric's online footprint to a remote town near Cordoba. A quiet life, new identity, teaching photography workshops to tourists. When authorities reached out, he denied everything. But days later, before extradition paperwork could finalize, he vanished again. Abandoned car, blood trace, inside camera, missing. It was as if the ghosts of 2003 had decided the story wasn't done. Back in Berlin, Richter sat alone in the evidence room staring at the photographs pinned across the wall. Lena smiled, the blurred faces around her, the empty street. The diary lay open under a dim lamp. He turned to the last page, one no one had read aloud before. The ink was faint but legible. When light meets shadow, he hides behind the lens. The meaning was clear now. This wasn't just about one girl's disappearance. It was about the gaze itself. The act of watching, controlling, freezing a moment forever. The diary wasn't a confession. It was a warning. And somewhere, maybe even now, someone was still watching. Rain lashed against the windows of the precinct that night, tapping out a rhythm too precise to ignore. Detective Richter hadn't slept in 40 hours. The glow of the evidence board painted his face in pale blue light. Threads of red string linked photographs, addresses, sketches from Lena's diary, all converging toward one haunting image. The Polaroid camera labeled "Truth is in the frame." The same words echoed in his head again and again. Somewhere inside that phrase, he felt, was the key. Meanwhile, the city of Berlin was awake. The story had reignited something dark in the public imagination. Candlelight vigils blurred with media frenzy. Talk shows dissected every theory: the obsessed professor, the missing photographer, the runaway student. Some called Lena a martyr of art. Others whispered that she'd been part of the project herself. Rumors consumed truth. For Richter, it wasn't noise. It was cover, the perfect smokescreen for someone still hiding. The forensics lab confirmed what he already suspected: the blood found in Eric Stahl's abandoned car matched his DNA. But the pattern of splatter didn't suggest violence, it looked staged. There was too little blood for a fatal wound, too deliberate. Whoever wanted Eric to vanish wanted the world to believe he was dead. Richter traced flight records from Cordoba and found that 3 days before the car was discovered, someone had purchased a one-way ticket to Warsaw under the alias Felix Mertens. Same initials, same ghost. The name was a message, a taunt, as if the story were repeating itself. At dawn, Richter flew to Warsaw. The Polish police didn't take long to join the investigation. They found traces of Eric at a photography workshop near the Vistula River. Students remembered him charming, quiet, obsessed with light and contrast. He carried an old Polaroid camera and often spoke of capturing truth. He left abruptly after one of his models went missing. A 19-year-old woman named Aneta Novak disappeared 2 weeks ago. Her roommate reported her last message. He says I remind him of someone named Lena. That single sentence reopened every wound. The same cycle 2 decades later. Back in Berlin, media pressure turned brutal. The university was accused of a cover-up spanning years, the academic world shaken by allegations of complicity. Files surfaced showing that Heinrich Stahl had been quietly protected by senior officials even after repeated complaints from students. Richter confronted him again, this time without politeness. The professor sat in silence, staring through the glass wall, the ghost of arrogance gone. "Where is your son?" Richter demanded. Stahl's lips trembled, not from fear but from memory. "I tried to save him," he said finally, "but I couldn't stop what I created." He confessed not to murder but to something more disturbing: that he had mentored Felix Merton not as a colleague but as an experiment. Felix was the first, the eye that sees everything. Eric wanted to become him. He described a project called Eidolon, an underground exhibition meant to erase the boundary between artist and subject. Students were unknowingly filmed in moments of vulnerability, crying "sleeping alone." Stahl claimed it was a philosophical exploration of exposure. But Merton took it further, crossing into obsession, turning art into control. "He started choosing them," Stahl whispered. "He said every face had a shadow twin. Lena was his." Richter's stomach tightened. If that was true, the project hadn't ended with Lena's death. It had evolved, mutated through Eric. The son had become the continuation of his father's idea, the living lens. In Warsaw, the search for Aneta Nowak intensified. Police tracked down an abandoned photography studio near Praga, rented under a false name 2 months prior. Inside, the smell of chemicals filled the air, developer fluid dust decay. Prints hung on wires, dripping. Faces of women stared back, candid, frightened, unaware. One wall was different. Dozens of photos formed a single mosaic: Lena's face, reconstructed piece by piece from different models' features. It was as if he'd been trying to rebuild her from memory, from fragments of strangers. In the center of the room, a single Polaroid camera rested on a stool. The same model. The same note taped inside: "Truth is in the frame." But this one had something new. When police developed the last image, they froze. It showed the reflection of the photographer himself, Eric, holding the camera, and behind him, on a shadowed wall, the faint outline of another figure. Older, taller, Heinrich Stahl. The timestamp was recent, 3 days before the professor's interrogation. Richter returned to Berlin, furious, storming into the interview room. He slammed the photograph onto the table. "You said you haven't seen him in years." Stahl stared at the image and whispered, "I haven't. But he's been watching me." That night, security cameras at Stahl's home captured movement outside, a figure pacing near the hedges, stopping to stare through the windows. By the time officers arrived, the figure was gone. In his garden, they found a single Polaroid photo pinned to the fence. It showed Stahl asleep in his armchair taken through the window. The caption scrawled in red ink, "You taught me to see." Richter knew the game had shifted. This wasn't about revenge. It was ritual continuation art transformed into madness. Every clue Eric left was deliberate staged for someone to find, as if each discovery was part of a script already written. The diary had predicted this spiral 20 years ago. Lena wrote about feeling like a photograph before it's taken, as though her fate was pre-developed waiting for exposure. The same sensation haunted Richter now. At 2:37 a.m., his phone rang. Warsaw police had found something near the Vistula Bridge, a body wrapped in plastic, half submerged in mud. Female, early 20s. Not Annetta. Older. Autopsy confirmed it within hours. Clara Voigt, the student who supposedly committed suicide in 2004. She'd been dead ever since, buried under a false report, her disappearance hidden behind paperwork and fear. Richter stood over the autopsy table, the room heavy with the smell of disinfectant and truth. Clara's body told its story. Ligature marks, broken fingers, traces of photography chemicals in her bloodstream. She hadn't killed herself. She'd been posed, just like the others. The missing pieces clicked. The diary, the project, the photographs, all fragments of a controlled narrative. Someone had been composing this story for 20 years. And now, as Richter stared at the photographs lining his office wall, he saw the same pattern repeating subject settings, cycles of disappearance. He realized what Lena meant in her final words. He writes too. This wasn't about a killer leaving evidence. It was about an author shaping his masterpiece. The city was his canvas, the victims his gallery. Every 20 years he would begin again, and the next exhibition was already being prepared. The morning Berlin awoke to the news of Clara Voigt's exhumation, the city seemed to exhale in disbelief. The newspapers screamed the same words across their front pages. Cold case turned serial nightmare. Forensic vans lined the courtyard of the police headquarters while reporters swarmed the gates like vultures. Inside, Richter stood in front of the incident board, eyes hollow, voice sharp. 20 years, 2 women, the same artistic signature. And still, no body for Lena Hoffman. Every lead pointed backward into a spiral of vanity, voyeurism, and violence disguised as art. The case file no longer felt like evidence. It felt like a confession written by the city itself. Stahl had gone silent after his son's Polaroid appeared on his fence. He refused food, refused a lawyer, spoke only once, whispering the same sentence over and over, "I see her every night." Psychiatric evaluation called it guilt-induced hallucination. Richter wasn't so sure. Because the next night, something impossible happened. A USB drive arrived in an unmarked envelope at the precinct reception. No sender. No fingerprints. Just one word written across the plastic in shaky pen frame. Inside were 37 photographs and 1 video file. The images were familiar candid shots of women in public places blurred by motion or rain. But the last image froze Richter's blood. It was a still from surveillance footage of the police headquarters itself, taken from across the street, showing Richter standing by the window in his office staring at the board. The caption beneath the photo read, "Truth looks back." He opened the video. Static first, then flickering light. A corridor. A camera moving slowly, deliberately breathing, almost audible behind the microphone. The lens turned toward a mirror, and, for a fraction of a second, Richter saw his own reflection live. Then darkness. Someone had filmed him from inside the building. Forensics found no digital trace of the video's origin. It hadn't been uploaded. It had been delivered by hand, which meant someone had walked into the precinct unnoticed. The realization hit him harder than any evidence before the watcher was inside. Internal affairs demanded a lockdown. Computers seized, phones confiscated. Every officer became both suspect and target. Richter's partner Vogt found herself replaying the video, obsessively slowing frames, until she noticed something others missed in the reflection behind Richter's face. A poster on the wall showed the date of Clara's supposed suicide, April 2004. The footage wasn't live. It was a reconstruction, a mirror of the past. Whoever sent it was recreating moments, reframing them one by one. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, investigators discovered that the photo studio where Eric worked had been rented using funds from a Berlin-based foundation, the same foundation that had once sponsored Stahl and Merton's exhibition Eidolon. The paper trail ran cold after 2005. Its last registered director was a woman named Dr. Verena Albrecht, a former university curator. When police reached her, she denied involvement, claiming she hadn't heard from either Stahl or Merton in decades. But as Richter reviewed her old phone records, something snapped into place. Repeated calls to a number linked to a private storage unit in Prenzlauer Berg. He sent a team. Inside the unit, beneath tarps and dust, they found boxes stacked floor-to-ceiling film reels, projectors, typewritten notes. The reels were labeled only by dates 2001, 2002, 2003, 2023, 20 years apart. The pattern again. One of the newer reels contained a short, silent film, grainy and colorless. It showed a woman walking through a tunnel holding a flashlight. The camera followed from behind. At the end of the tunnel, she turned, and it was Lena Hoffmann, or someone who looked exactly like her, the timestamp 3 months ago. Richter paused. The film rewound, slowed it down frame by frame. The gestures, the tilt of the head identical to Lena's movement in the 2003 convenience store footage. But the background gave it away. The tunnel had collapsed years ago. It was impossible, unless someone had rebuilt it. Forensics visited the supposed location near the Spree River, where the tunnel had once been sealed. To their disbelief, the entry had been cleared, recently illegally reopened. Inside, they found camera equipment, generators, and a new tripod. The entire place was being used again. Fresh footprints in the mud led to the water's edge. One print matched Eric Stahl's shoe size. Another was smaller, possibly female. The investigation expanded to include human trafficking, illegal film production, even ritualistic cult behavior. But none of those labels fit the reality. This wasn't commerce. It was composition, a structure repeating itself every 20 years. Vogt was the first to see it clearly. She printed the map of every discovery site, the warehouse, the tunnel, the apartment, the storage unit. When pinned together, the coordinates formed the outline of a camera lens. The geometry was perfect, deliberate. Someone had turned Berlin into a blueprint for his masterpiece. "He's composing the city," she whispered. "Every location is a frame." Richter stared at the map for minutes before realizing what that meant. The center of the lens shape, the focal point, fell directly on one place, the old technical university building where Lena studied, now abandoned for renovation, the same place where her last day began. A decision was made within hours. Full search operation, night entry. Officers surrounded the derelict campus, flashlight slicing through dust and silence. Inside, classrooms were stripped bare, chalkboards ghosted with old formulas. Then, deep in the basement, they found a door welded shut. Fresh welds. They cut it open. Behind it was a makeshift studio, walls covered in photographs. Lights still warm. On one table lay a stack of new Polaroids, each stamped with that same handwritten phrase, "Truth is in the frame." The most recent one showed Detective Vogt leaving her apartment that morning. The next one showed her standing by the squad car. The third, her inside the building, flashlight raised. And the fourth, taken seconds ago, her looking directly at the camera. The flash went off before anyone could react. Chaos erupted. Officers swept the area shouting. The flash had come from the corner of the room behind a curtain. When they tore it down, all they found was a mounted camera rig pointed at the entrance, still smoking from the last photo. On the floor, a note written in black ink. "You finally stepped into the frame." Vogt's face drained of color. The photograph developed slowly in the air, showing the team exactly as they stood, her Richter and 3 officers. Someone had taken the picture from inside the room seconds before they entered. The impossible became real again. The presence wasn't just near, it was among them. And outside in the darkness beyond the university's broken windows, a faint click echoed the unmistakable sound of a shutter. Somewhere out there, someone was still taking pictures. The night the shutter echoed through the university ruins, every light in the building flickered, as if reacting to an unseen pulse. Richter froze mid-step, the metallic taste of fear cutting through his throat. Vogt swung her flashlight toward the window, but the beam caught nothing, just floating dust and empty glass. Yet the click came again, slow, measured, like breathing disguised as machinery. Officers spread out through the courtyard radios, crackling with static, every corner of the campus soaked in tension. Someone was out there watching them watch themselves. The Polaroid they'd found was still developing on the table. Vogt leaned closer, and her breath caught there behind their figures, barely visible in the shadows. A face reflected in the cracked mirror. Eyes wide open. A faint grin. When forensics enhanced it later, the image matched Eric Stahl. But the timestamp printed at the bottom didn't make sense. It wasn't tonight's date. It read April 3rd, 2003, the night Lena disappeared. That single line of ink fractured the case again. Either someone had manipulated the image, or Eric had never stopped reliving that night. Richter knew what it meant. Whoever was orchestrating this was reconstructing the original disappearance in real time, frame by frame, as though trying to perfect the first scene that went wrong. It's performance, he muttered. He's restaging the crime. Vogt's voice was sharp. Then where's the audience? The answer arrived before dawn. A live stream. Thousands of people across Germany woke to a mysterious broadcast link shared on encrypted forums and art subcultures. The title read, Eidolon 2, the frame completed. The stream showed a dimly lit room, a single chair, and an empty Polaroid camera mounted on a tripod. Every few minutes, the frame flickered, new photos appeared pinned to the wall behind the chair. First Lena's student ID, then Clara's portrait. Then a third image, Aneta Novak, the missing Warsaw girl. And finally, a fourth freshly taken Detective Vogt, her face captured from the previous night. The chat exploded. Viewers debated whether it was real performance art or snuff. The IP was traced to multiple servers, Germany, Poland, Argentina, all bouncing through encrypted networks. But one server pinged back to Berlin, the same abandoned university. The police stormed the site again. This time, the air felt wrong, charged, metallic, almost humming. In the main lecture hall, they found a new setup. Multiple projectors casting the live stream feed onto walls, each image bleeding into another. On one screen, Lena walked down a corridor. On another, Eric adjusted the focus on his camera. The images looped endlessly, a self-consuming gallery, and in the center of it all stood a mannequin wearing Lena's red jacket. A camera hung from its neck, still warm. Richter picked it up. Inside the film was undeveloped. He hesitated, knowing what came next. He pressed the release and watched as the white square slid out, humming softly as it printed an image into being. As the photo darkened, his hands trembled. The picture showed not the mannequin, but himself holding the camera, face blurred by motion. Someone was photographing him as he photographed the scene. "We're inside it," he said quietly. "He's built a frame around us." Vogt moved toward the stage where a large screen projected a countdown. 001703. Below it, text faded in final exposure, 20 years in the making. A voice came through the speakers, distorted, genderless, layered like multiple recordings stacked on top of each other. "You looked for truth," it said. "You built your stories. But truth only exists when seen. I showed you how." The voice paused, then whispered, "Look behind you." Officers spun, weapons drawn. The main door stood open, swinging slowly. A Polaroid photo fluttered in from the wind, landing face up. Vogt bent down, picked it up, and froze. It was a live image of their team taken seconds before. The flash had been real, and behind them in the picture, a figure in a black coat was standing by the doorway, the exact spot where no one stood now. They chased through the hallways, the echo of boots blending with rain. Every room they entered was lined with photographs, faces of the missing, smiles frozen mid-life, each labeled with a word muse: frame, study, subject. The deeper they went, the fresher the prints became, still drying, glossy, smelling of chemicals. The most recent ones showed Vogt and Richter entering the building earlier that night, time-stamped minutes apart. Whoever was here had been one step ahead all along. At the top floor, a door slammed. Vogt raised her weapon, kicked it open. The smell hit them, first film developer and decay. The room was lit by red lamps, On one wall, dozens of negatives hung from wires dripping. In the center stood a man in a raincoat, back-turned hands covered in chemical stains. He was holding a Polaroid camera. Richter shouted his name. Eric. The man didn't move. Put it down, Richter demanded. Eric turned slowly. His face was pale, hollow eyes, unfocused like a sleepwalker's. He smiled faintly. You came, he whispered. I waited for someone who would finally understand. He placed the camera on the table, stepped back. It's all here. Every truth you ever wanted. He gestured around the room to the photographs, to the suspended negatives, to the film reels spinning in the corner. Lena wanted to leave something behind. I only finished what she started. Richter's voice hardened. You killed her. Eric shook his head. No, I developed her. Before they could react, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the red light. Developer fluid, he said softly. Do you know what it does to skin when overexposed? He smiled, raised it to his lips, but Vogt fired first. The sound cracked through the silence, echoing down the corridor. Eric collapsed, the vial shattering across the floor. The fluid spread like blood. He was still breathing, whispering something through the pain. Richter leaned in close. It's not over, Eric rasped. You think you've seen the frame? But you haven't seen who's holding it. He died before saying another word. The next hours blurred into reports, evidence collection, silence. The university was sealed again. The live stream ended abruptly, replaced by static. The world moved on, briefly satisfied with closure. But Richter couldn't rest. Something about Eric's last words lingered. Back in his office, he opened the confiscated camera. Inside was one last undeveloped photograph. He developed it carefully alone. The image revealed Lena standing under a streetlight, rain glistening on her hair, and behind her, blurred but visible, another photographer holding a camera to his eye. It wasn't Eric. It wasn't Merton. It was someone older, with the same sharp cheekbones and cold eyes. Professor Heinrich Stahl. Richter stared at the image until dawn, the city waking up outside his window. For 20 years, the professor had insisted he didn't know what happened to Lena Hoffmann. But the truth was always in the frame, and now, finally, the frame was closing. The morning after Eric Stahl's death, Berlin woke beneath a heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on every rooftop as if the city itself were trying to suffocate what it had just remembered. The university remained sealed, guarded by police tape that flapped weakly in the wind. Reporters shouted questions through the rain, desperate for a quote, a headline, an ending. But there was no ending, only residue. The press called it closure, but Richter called it illusion. He'd seen the photograph, the one taken decades ago under the streetlight, Lena's final moment, captured by a hand that was not Eric's. The face behind the camera belonged to Professor Heinrich Stahl, and Stahl was still alive. Inside the interrogation wing, Stahl sat motionless, his wrists cuffed to the table, his eyes locked on the small window where a sliver of daylight spilled in. He looked older overnight, the arrogance gone, replaced by something hollow, almost tranquil. When Richter entered, he didn't look up. You lied, Richter said quietly, laying the photograph between them. Stahl's gaze flickered. The old instincts returned: denial, evasion, the performance of innocence. That could be anyone, he murmured. Richter leaned forward. It's you. It's your camera. The same Leica you used for the Eidolon series. You took that picture the night Lena disappeared. Stahl finally looked at him, and in his eyes, something cracked. Not guilt, recognition. She wanted me to, he said softly. You don't understand. She wanted to be seen. His voice trembled between confession and delusion. She said the only way to exist forever was through the lens. I gave her that. Richter slammed his palm on the table. You gave her nothing. You took her life. Stahl didn't flinch. He stared past the detective as if speaking to someone else entirely. The frame was always meant to close, he whispered. Forensics re-examined everything. The Leica found in his study contained a damaged roll of film, undeveloped. When processed, the negatives revealed the same location as Lena's last sighting, the alley near the convenience store. Several frames showed her looking back at the camera, fear in her eyes. The final frame was blank, overexposed by a flash too close, erasing her completely. Between those two moments, she had vanished. Stahl's lawyer demanded dismissal, citing mental deterioration. But Richter refused to let the case dissolve into madness. He ordered a psychological evaluation. The report returned with chilling details. Stahl suffered from advanced dementia. His memories fragmented, alternating between guilt and creation. He could no longer distinguish reality from his own art. The doctors called it confabulation. Richter called it convenience. Because deep down, he knew there were too many deliberate acts, too many perfect reconstructions for this to be simple decay. Someone had helped him stage the last chapters. That night, Richter returned home to find an envelope waiting on his doorstep. No name, no address, inside a single Polaroid photograph. It showed his own apartment building, window-lit blinds half open. Through the glass, his own silhouette stood by the table. The caption read, "You've joined the exhibition." His pulse spiked. He scanned the street, empty. The rain fell harder. He called Vogt immediately. She answered on the first ring, breathless as if expecting it. "I got one too," she said. "My balcony, taken from across the courtyard." Someone was continuing the work, or someone had never stopped. They traced the film stock, an obsolete Polaroid type discontinued in 2004. Only one known dealer in Germany still had vintage packs. Richter and Vogt visited the address, a tiny photography shop in Kreuzberg walls lined with faded portraits and antique cameras. The owner, an elderly man named Otto, recognized the model immediately. Yes, the old film," he said. "Rare these days. A young man bought several boxes last month. Tall, quiet, wore gloves, paid in cash." He handed them the receipt. The name written on it was Impossible Felix Merton. "Felix is dead," Vogt said flatly. Otto shrugged. He said he was preparing a retrospective. Something about the witness returns. Back at headquarters, Richter pulled the old Merton file from the archives. Cause of disappearance, presumed self-exile. No confirmed death. No body. Just a rumor of Argentina. And now his name had resurfaced, attached to the same signature obsession. The realization was suffocating. If Merton was alive, he'd had 20 years to evolve, to refine, to teach. Maybe Eric hadn't been the puppet master after all. Maybe he'd been the apprentice. That night, Berlin's streets turned into mirrors. Screens flickered in bars, stations, apartments. A viral message spreading across private channels. The same phrase appeared everywhere. "The witness returns one night only." Attached was a location pin. The address, the derelict movie theater on Frankfurter Allee, closed since 2006. Command authorized a controlled entry. Richter and Vogt led the team in flashlights, slicing through layers of dust and mold. The air smelled of damp velvet and celluloid. The projector was running. On the cracked white screen, images flickered, the same black and white sequences from the warehouse reels. Lena walking, Clara crying, Eric developing film, and then live footage. Vogt gasped. The feed switched to them, their own silhouettes crossing the theater aisles, projected larger than life. "It's live," Richter whispered. "He's watching us right now." The projector booth loomed above them. They climbed the narrow stairwell, each creak echoing like a heartbeat. When they reached the door, it was open. Inside, the projector ran on a timer, empty reels spinning. A single chair faced the glass window. On it lay a Polaroid camera and a folded note. Richter unfolded it slowly. "You've always looked in the wrong direction." He turned to the glass and froze. Across the street, through the rain-smeared window, the faint red glow of another building blinked. The word "frame" was spelled out in neon letters, flickering above a studio sign that hadn't existed on any registry. They rushed outside, crossing the street, guns drawn. The door creaked open before they touched it. Inside, a gallery, weighted walls lined with portraits, each lit from below. Every photograph was one of the victims, but the last frame was empty, a single spotlight waiting for its subject. On the table lay an invitation card, its surface glossy new, printed in black ink, final exhibition March 3rd, 2023, subject R. Richter. He stared at the card as if it were bleeding. Vogt whispered, "He's making you the next frame." Before Richter could respond, a shutter clicked again, this time inches behind him. He spun, but the flash blinded everything. When his vision cleared, the doorway was empty. Only the smell of film chemicals lingered in the air. And on the wall beside him, pinned with a steel tack, was a fresh Polaroid still drying. It showed him frozen mid-turn eyes, wide with fear. Below the image, scrawled in red ink, were 3 words, "Now you see." The gallery lights hummed like bees trapped behind glass, a low electric drone that made every breath sound louder than it should. Richter stood in front of his own face, pinned to the wall. The Polaroid still ripening from gray to black, the edges warping with heat from the spotlight. The 3 words below it bled into his mind until they weren't ink anymore. "Now you see." Vogt hovered at his shoulder weapon down, but wrists tight, eyes flicking from frame to frame, counting the victims like a rosary. Lena, Clara, Annetta. 2 more who had never been connected to the case until this instant. A woman from 2001 whose missing poster had become wallpaper in the police archives. A student from 2002 whose mother still lit candles on a balcony in Wedding. All of them poised, curated, the composition precise. The last empty rectangle glared like a mouth waiting to swallow something. He knew which name would be etched there when the exhibition closed. R. Richter. He felt the weight of his own initials in the air, heavier than the gun on his hip. The projector across the street still pulsed the theater window, beating red heartbeat red as if it were sealing the negative in the dark. Vogt touched the invitation card gingerly as though the paper might hiss. 3/3/23, she murmured. "We're past that date." "Backdated invitations," Richter said. "A story told after it's already happened." The notion slipped into his spine like a blade. Somewhere, an author was writing ahead of the scene, staging consequences before the cause. The floorboards under the gallery carpet sighed. Vogt saw it too, a subtle puff of dust at the baseboard, a breath the room shouldn't have. She pulled the carpet with one sharp motion. A service hatch. Screws, fresh paint bright, no dust in the grooves. They pried it open and found a camera pointed straight up through a grid of pinholes in the carpet. The lens tilted to catch faces at the exact moment they approached the empty frame. Below the lens, a second camera faced outward at knee height, staring through a narrow slit toward the street door. A tunnel ran under the floor, narrow as a coffin. It smelled like damp velvet and developer. And somewhere in that throat of wood and concrete, a shutter clicked. Vogt went first, crouched, the beam of her flashlight pulled long and thin by the tunnel walls. The passage elbowed left, then right, like a hand guiding a pose. Cables scraped their sleeves. The clicking stopped. Silence pooled. Then a whisper from the dark ahead, tiny and mechanical, almost polite. A printer ejecting a square. They crawled faster. The tunnel opened into a pocket room under the gallery. A table sat at the center with a small instant printer spitting out white squares that browned into images under the dull red bulb. On the nearest print, Richter recognized their own heads in silhouette bending over the hatch 4 minutes earlier. "Now you see." He grabbed the stack and flipped. Each image was a different angle of the same moment, as if the room had eyes. One showed a man's hand adjusting a dial. Another showed the tunnel behind them, empty though they'd been crawling through it at the time. The angles didn't add up. Something filmed them from positions that didn't exist. Vogt lifted the red bulb, squinting. No heat source except this. Whoever ran this space knew exactly how long to keep the film warm. She pointed at a faint outline on the table's edge, the shadow of a Leica body recently removed. Richter tasted metal in the back of his mouth. He knows how long we need to arrive, how long our curiosity lasts, how long it takes to turn an officer into a subject. He bagged the prints. "We're leaving," he said. Not like this. Not in his frame. They emerged into night that felt a degree colder, as if the city had inhaled around them. The theater's projector went dark. Across the street, the neon frame sign died with a click. The street became an empty stage. Their cars waited slick with rain. The squad radio hissed awake dispatch reporting a break-in at the Technical University site, the basement studio. Movement on sensors, then nothing. A decoy or a loop. They drove anyway. The streets cut past in flashes of sodium light. Every windshield became a mirror. Braun, the forensics tech, met them at the service entrance. His face was waxy with dread. "Something new," he said, voice too flat. In the studio. The room looked as they had left it last night except for the table. On the table lay Lena's diary. Not the waterlogged artifact from under the bicycle. Not the spine that crumbled when you turned it. A second diary. Dry intact, the same black cloth cover, the same hand-ruled lines, the same tight handwriting. On the first page, scrawled like a trap, "If anything happens, don't believe what they say about me." He writes too. Richter felt the world tilt vertigo in place. 2 diaries, 2 voices. One truth split and mirrored. Vogt gloved up and turned pages carefully. The entries covered only April the last 11 days, and then stopped on April 3rd with a single page torn out. The page had been sliced cleanly with a blade. The edge shimmered the way photo paper shimmered when cut. There were smudges in the margin shaped like fingerprints. One print had a scar ridge. The same crescent scar that had cut across Heinrich Stahl's ring finger when he'd sliced his hand on a glass negative in 1998. Richter had read the old accident report enough times to dream it. He checked the timestamp on the motion sensor report. 37 minutes ago. Enough time for someone to slide a duplicate book into a room and vanish. He looked at the ceiling vents. Fresh dust rings around the screws. Braun swallowed. "You think he has the original?" "I think he wrote the duplicate," Richter said. "And I think Lena anticipated it." He turned the diary upside down and shook it gently. A shimmer fell out, a translucent strip glued between pages. He peeled it free. It was a contact sheet, tiny frames of negatives arranged in a grid. The images were faint, almost spectral stairwells, a door number, a bridge pillar, the blurred shape of a face with eyes scratched out. Numbers were etched into the margin in pencil, then rubbed away. He tilted the sheet to the light and saw the rubbings had left indentations that hadn't fully erased. The sequence reappeared under the angle like a watermark. 52.5-29513.4127. GPS coordinates. The point dropped in his head like a pin in a map. A canal lock east of Museum Island, where the old print shops had once pumped ink into the river. They moved in quiet urgency, sirens cold. The lock stood like a jaw in the water, metal teeth slick, the current chewing the city's reflections into strips. Under the bridge, the rain thickened into ropes. The beam of Vogt's flashlight caught chalk marks on the support column, concentric circles like the rings of a lens. In the center, a tiny drawn eye. A hatch bolted into the pillar had new scratches around its edges. They pried at muscles, snarling, and it gave. A small cavity. Inside, a Leica. An original Model M6 black paint worn to brass on the edges. The strap smelled like old sweat and developer. Taped to the base was a strip of paper. "Take me where the river turns to glass." It was a line from Lena's April 1st entry, the one everyone had dismissed as poetic fog. Vogt whispered the rest from memory because she'd lived with the book in her coat for months. Past the pillars and the cranes. Past the eyes that do not blink. To the place where light refuses to die. The river turns to glass at dawn in one place first, the weir by the old glassworks in Oberschöneweide, where the current flattens and the factory windows turn the water into a pane. They drove through a city that felt like it was being pulled into a darkroom tray. The factory sat on the bank like a shipwreck, windows shattered, letters fallen. Glassworker in a broken smile across the roofline. Inside the floor was a blistered skin of lacquer. Footprints led across it, the edges crisp with recent wet. 2 sets. One heavy tread, one lighter. Perhaps a woman. The echo in the hall made their own steps sound rehearsed as if they had been recorded yesterday and were now being played back. A projector ran somewhere, a slow whir, the sound of a breath that never ends. They followed it to a central hall that had once been a showroom. The walls were covered in mirrors, some intact, most spider-webbed, reflecting their beams into a geometry that made direction meaningless. In the center, a screen hung like a sheet on a clothesline. The projector threw onto it a looped film. Lena writing. Lena closing the diary. Lena tucking a key into the hem of her backpack. Freeze. Repeat. Freeze. Repeat. Vogt stepped closer to the screen and saw the loop's flaw. The frame rate stuttered on the key as if the film had been spliced around that gesture 100 times. He needed that moment, she said, so he could keep her forever at the threshold. Richter walked along the mirror wall, letting his light skate. Something behind the mirrored glass returned the beam too eagerly. He rapped the pane. It sounded thick, hollow wrong. He smashed it with his baton. Behind the mirror lay a narrow corridor, on one side a slotted window to watch the hall unseen. On the other, cubby shelves with index cards and reels. Each cubby was labeled in a hand he recognized from the storage unit, Subject 01, Subject 02, Subject 03. He ran his fingers over the worn pencil grooves. Subject 00 had no card, just 4 blank reels and a stack of contact sheets. The name penciled faintly on the edge of a sheet. Eidolon Prologue. Vogt found a light switch in the corridor. The hall flared and the loop on screen changed as if the electricity had jolted the projector awake. Now it showed the street corner in 2003. The convenience store door. The rain beating like needles on the awning. A man at the edge of the frame raising a camera. Not Merton. Not Eric. Heinrich Stahl. The film trembled as if ashamed of itself. A second figure ghosted behind him out of focus, a narrow face, sharp jaw. Felix, the author and the eye caught in the same rectangle at last. He was there, Vogt said, the words sanded down to the core. Together. The air shifted with a new presence. Steps. Slow, deliberate, not hiding. They turned as one weapon, steady. A man emerged from the far door. He was older than the rumors around his name. Lean. Not a ghost. Not a myth. Hands empty. Eyes curious as if studying them under museum light. Felix Merton smiled without warmth. You came to the glass, he said. Good. His voice wasn't layered anymore. It was a single practiced tone that slid along the walls like a blade. Stop, Richter said. But what he meant was, explain yourself. Turn back time. Give me a shape for the thing you made. 20 years, Felix said, glancing at the screen where his younger self hovered behind Stahl like a reflection. 20 years to perfect one image. We were close. We were always very close. Where is Annetta Novak Vogt? Said not a question, but a bullet. Alive, Felix said. For now. Her presence sharpens the edge of the lens. Fear always does. You're done, Richter said. But even as he spoke, he understood the trap of declaring endings inside a room built for loops. Felix tilted his head. Endings belong to editors. I only collect moments. He gestured at the mirrors. I frame the city. The city develops the truth. Richter stepped sideways, closing the angle, keeping the gun steady, but lowering his voice as if confiding in a child. Lena tried to escape your frame. She wrote a diary to puncture it. She left coordinates, contact sheets, scratches under tape. She wrote too. Felix's eyes warmed with something like admiration. She was the only one who understood. She knew that cold case is not a genre but a state. Not solved or unsolved. Frozen. Preserved. Ready for better light. You killed her, Vogt said. Felix's face didn't move. We placed her where light would not betray her. She chose the place. Ask the professor. He remembers what you taught him to remember, Richter said. He remembers the art, but not the blood. Felix looked at the Leica in Richter's hand. You brought her camera. Good. Then finish it. Finish what exposed the last frame. The projector stuttered. The loop changed again. A live feed this time, too clean to be film. A woman sat in a chair somewhere in the building, a bright rectangle behind her back like a window. Tape on her wrists, but not tight enough to bruise. Annetta, eyes open, breathing quick. Behind her, a mirror reflected darkness. A timer in the corner of the feed ticked down from 0959. You set a bomb, Vogt said. No, Felix said. I set a horizon. His hands remained empty, palms shone as if to say, I am unarmed. I am only here to watch you draw your gun. Richter studied the room in the feed. Not this hall. Smaller, no mirrors, bare plaster. A window that was not a window. A light box. The kind used to view negatives. The light had a soft blue bloom. He turned in a slow circle and saw a door with a painted arrow almost erased by time. Dark room. They ran. The corridor shuddered the sound of their boots into a single echo, a single subject moving through a single line. The dark room door was ajar. The heat inside kissed their faces like a fever. Red lamps, a plasticky smell. Annetta sat where the feed said she would be taped to a chair under the lightbox glow. Her eyes lit when she saw them, then narrowed in warning. Behind, she rasped. Richter spun. A lens glinted in a slit in the wall. A camera watched a tiny eye and a surgical cut. He fired. The glass spidered the feed died. The timer froze at 03:17. Vogt cut the tape from Annetta's wrists while Richter scanned for the rest of the trap. Nothing on the ceiling. No wires. No canisters. Only a thin frame mounted on a rail around the chair, painted matte black so it blended with the walls. A frame that could slide like a guillotine. The mechanism hummed, then stopped. Someone had cut power the second the camera died. Felix's voice floated from the corridor, not far, not yelling. You see, truth only needs the slightest interruption to reveal itself. Richter pulled Annetta up. Her legs shook but held. How long, he asked. 2 days, she said. He made me sit. He made me look. He talked about light like it was God. Did he touch you? Vogt asked. Only with the camera, Annetta said, and that answer was its own violence. They moved her into the hall, where air felt like a different element. The projector in the showroom showed only white, now the loop amputated. Mirrors returned them to themselves in broken slices. Felix was gone from the center of the room, but a fresh Polaroid hung on a nail where his chest had been. The image showed an empty chair under a dead timer. Beneath it, in handwriting steady as a ruler, the missing student's diary changes everything but not the author. Richter closed his fist around the Leica until his knuckles burned. The cold case had thawed into something liquid that moved wherever it wanted, and the author wasn't written in any report. He looked at the mirror corridor, at the cubbies at Subject 00, the prologue. He looked at the diary duplicate on the studio table hours earlier, the torn page, the scar ridge in the margin. He saw the outline of a hand that had composed all of this. Not a son, not a mentor, not a ghost with a camera, a curator, a person who had chosen the angle, paid the rent, moved the frames when no one was looking. Dr. Verena Albrecht had signed invoices for the Foundation, signed rental agreements for storage units, signed for the silent projector bulbs that kept the loops alive. Her signature sat under 20 years of logistics like a watermark no one wanted to read. We go to Verena, he said. Now, as they guided Annetta into the night, the river below the factory smoothed into a sheet of black glass. The city's lights lay on it without sinking a perfect print. Somewhere nearby, a shutter clicked like a wink, and the sound carried on the water long after the photographer was gone. The rain let up just enough for the streets to shine like a sheet of exposed film, every light etched into the asphalt, as if the city had been laid on a light table and backlit by something that didn't care about sleep. Richter drove without speaking. Annetta, pale but steady, sat in the back with a blanket the EMT had insisted on, fingers worrying the edge like she might rub sound away. Vogt scrolled through addresses for Dr. Verena Albrecht, the curator whose name had threaded itself behind 20 years of invoices and storage units like a watermark. A townhouse in Charlottenburg, second-floor balcony full of dead geraniums. A studio at the museum annex basement level, climate-controlled. A private P.O. box near Savigneplatz. The studio, Richter said. If she's a curator, she lives where the objects breathe. He didn't say the other thing he believed, the thing his pulse had already accepted. The author doesn't sleep until the edit locks. The museum annex was all glass and quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows footsteps and hands you back your own breath. After hours, but the night guard recognized the badges and the case. Everyone recognized the case now. Everyone had an opinion. The guard signed them in with a pen that didn't squeak and said the lower archive doors had logged one entry at 1906 and no exit. Who? Vogt asked. He frowned at the monitor, a thirst in his eyes that suggested he enjoyed being necessary. Keycard number belongs to Dr. Albrecht, he said, and he tried not to look satisfied when they didn't hide their urgency. They descended into cold air, the kind of cold that knows how to hold paper flat and keep emulsion from sweating. The corridor had a hiss to it, a whisper of recirculated atmosphere, and the floor lights clicked on one at a time, guiding them into the frame like stage cues. The door to the private studio stood ajar, an old-fashioned civility in a place built around keycards. The sign beside the door said Conservation Lab in clean sans serif, and below it a placard with a name: Dr. Verena Albrecht, Chief Conservator, not curator, conservator, someone who keeps things from disappearing and decides which stains count as history. Inside the room glowed a careful white, work tables, gloves and nests, loop lenses, a light box spread with contact sheets so neatly aligned they looked printed onto the glass. Against the far wall, a glass cabinet held a forest of reels and camera bodies like trophies. The air smelled of camphor and old gelatin and something floral that clung to the back of the tongue. Annetta inhaled, startled. That perfume, she said the word bitten. She wore it when she checked the tape. She said the adhesive had a memory. Stay behind me, Vogt said gently, positioning herself between Annetta and the room, as if the light itself might touch too hard. Richter circled the tables, eyes scanning for the moment that didn't fit. Every lab has a mistake. A fingerprint, a hair under a tape edge. Verena's mistake was a rhythm, each contact sheet numbered in pencil at the lower right, a curatorial habit until one sheet broke the count and placed its number at the top left like a signature turned sideways. The sheet's images were familiar stairwells, doorways, a bridge pillar, but the pencil pressure had left deeper indentations than the others, the graphite pressed like a whisper that wanted to leave a bruise. He tilted the glass and read the shadow of a phrase, the ghost of an erased note. Subject 00 holds. Hold what? Time, breath, power. A latch clicked softly in the adjoining room. Vogt turned her head the way an animal does before the wind changes. She slid along the wall and peered around the doorway. The adjoining room was darker red bulbs like low moons. At a central sink, gloved hands lifted a strip of film out of a tray and let the chemicals drip in a silvery veil. The woman didn't flinch when Vogt stepped in with her gun leveled at the tile between shoulder and ear. She just kept watching the film like it might speak if no one startled it. Dr. Albrecht Vogt said, and made the name both greeting and conclusion. Verena turned her head sidelong, not quite looking at them, cheekbone catching the red light, older than her photographs, younger than her paperwork. No jewelry, no watch hair pinned with a librarian's mercy. Detective, she said. Her voice was quiet but quick, a scalpel that knows it is necessary. You brought the river with you. I hear it on your shoes. She lowered the film into water and the line of it ceased to tremble. Hands where I can see them, Vogt said. Verena obeyed and still managed to look like the person in every room who knows where the exits are. I wondered how long it would take you, she said. You follow the ink because you are trained to believe ink tells the truth. I follow the emulsion because I know the truth is not on the surface. You finance them, Richter said, stepping into the red saal. Merton, the exhibitions, the storage. You paid for the rooms and the reels and the bulbs that keep the loops alive. I conserve them, Verena said. Your city throws away its own memory. Artists die. Their work is misattributed. Their notes are called rambling. The young women you found are remembered as names on posters. I refuse that. Cold case detective is not just murder. It is an archive, frozen until someone brings proper light. You sugared poison with poetry, Vogt said. Where is Felix Merton? Verena's eyes warmed with something like pride and something like contempt. Felix is a terrible curator, she said. He wants the frame to be the subject. He wants the audience to notice the angle. Do you know what real conservation requires? Discretion. She lifted her hands fractionally. That is why he makes so much noise. That is why he's useful and impossible. That is why you will never catch him in the room you expect. Where is he, Richter said low. Verena smiled in the way academic men have always smiled at students whose thesis they intend to dismantle. Turn on the light, she said, and nodded toward the adjacent wall. A switch, but be prepared. Light finishes a photograph. It also destroys it. He flicked the switch. The white lab lights flooded over a second wall he hadn't seen, tilting the entire room into clarity so stark it tripped his breath. A grid of glass slides, each mounted like a precious insect, each containing not a specimen but a sliver of paper. Torn margins, broken lines. Every piece labeled in Verena's small, precise hand. Lena, April 2nd, page 3 edge. Lena, April 3rd, top margin. Clara, undated lower third. It was a taxidermy of voices. The diary had been cut and preserved. The missing page from April 3rd had not been lost. It had been curated. Cold cases are built on belief, Verena said softly, moving not at all. You believed in the sanctity of that book. I believed in its instability. She was 22. She wrote fear like a genius and code like an amateur. He writes too, she said. She meant what all 22-year-olds mean. The author is always a man in their imagination. I removed the page that would have complicated your narrative. I kept it safe from the weather of your certainty. Show us, Vogt said. Take it, Verena said. But then you must admit you have been reading An Incomplete City for months. She nodded toward the grid, third row, fourth slide. Richter approached, hands trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. The slide sat in a stainless steel cradle. He lifted it, the glass cold and righteous, and read the fragment through the loop Verena had left on the table like an offering. April 3rd, 1940. She stopped writing him into this. Stop using his pronoun to prove he exists. When light meets shadow, she hides behind the lens. She writes too. She edits what I am allowed to see. If I disappear, do not trust the notes that arrive after. They will be beautiful. They will be wrong. The room shifted under his feet as if the building had decided it was a ship. She, he said aloud, and the syllable left a salt taste in his mouth. The diary had not only warned about the gaze and the stalk and the men who collect. It had named the editor. It had named the conservator. You edited a life, Vogt said, each word a blade shaved thinner than the last. You turned a warning into a misdirection. You kept the city chasing his shadow while you wrote the lighting plan. I kept the record from dissolving into sentiment, Verena said. Felix would have burned every negative to keep his myth hot. Heinrich would have lost the story to his illness. I made the archive stable. You made murder elegant, Richter said, and the white light faltered in his vision. Verena's jaw tightened by a hair. Do you know what got Lena killed, detective? Not me. Not Felix. Not even Heinrich's arrogance. She thought the act of writing would save her. She believed that leaving breadcrumbs was the same as leaving a map. She underestimated our ability to read. Where is her body? Vogt said, not moving her gun, not moving at all, except the muscle that carries a sentence to its target. Verena's eyes flicked to the cabinet where the camera bodies stood like captured animals. Do you know what conservation means in Latin? She asked. To keep together. To hold in one. She exhaled, calm, breaking at the edges. You want a grave? You want coordinates. But the city develops the truth in baths, not in a line. She is where the emulsion holds, where the silver remembers, where you have already looked and decided the reflection was enough. Speak clearly, Richter said. Verena looked at Annetta, and for an instant the clinical gleam thinned into something colder. He makes them sit, she said. I make them remain. She tilted her head. Look under the cabinet, detective. He crouched. A toe kick panel ran along the base. He pried it with his fingers until the wood complained and then relented. Behind it, darkness, and then the soft hiss of a gasket releasing. A recess. Inside a sealed glass box about the size of a shoebox, humidity beads, crawling like slow rain. The box contained a red jacket folded into itself like a sleeping animal, a spiral notebook wrapped in plastic, a key sewn into the hem with a stitch too neat for a desperate hand. And hair. Long, dark, caught in a snag on the zipper, preserved as if the air had never touched it. The room's silence changed shape. Annetta made a sound that didn't decide whether to be human. Vogt's mouth worked once, and then shut. Richter reached through the cold and lifted the box. It had weight, and the weight wasn't the jacket. Beneath the jacket, something dense. He held the box up, and the light revealed a shape under the spiral, a brick of film canisters, black old, labeled in the same small hand, Eidolon Master 2003. Next to it, another label, a later date, Eidolon Corrections 2023. Chain of custody, Verena said. You needed it. I provided it. You think you hate me because I hid clarity, but you hate me because I preserved it better than you ever could. Vogt moved then, not with violence, but with finality. She kept the gun in her left hand, and with her right she took hold of Verena's wrist, guided it behind her back, and said the words that turn a person into evidence. The conservator didn't resist. She watched the red bulbs stain the film unevenly and shook her head slightly, annoyed not at the handcuffs, but at bad processing. Felix will not like this, she said. He adores a woman who can keep a story intact. Where is he? Richter said, the box heavy and perfect in his arms. Verena closed her eyes as if embarrassed by their naivete. He's where stories go to be cleansed, she said, where you cannot carry guns, where people whisper because echo ruins the reverence. She opened her eyes. He's at the place you have already been without understanding you were being seated. She waited a beat. He's in the gallery. The frame sight, Vogt said. No, Verena said, and the precision of her scorn made the room colder. The other gallery, the one that never closes, the one with pews. The word lit in Richter's head like a flash. Gallery, nave, a church. The city's oldest camera obscura. The cathedral at Museum Island, where light pours through stained glass and carves faces into color, where tourists line up to be framed by history, where guards are trained to protect images from touching. He didn't wait for the elevator. He ran. Vogt dragged Verena with her Annetta between them like a pulse they refused to lose. The night guard's eyes widened when the evidence box appeared, when the name on the label announced a resurrection no press release could contain. Outside, Berlin had turned the rain back on the street, slick and righteous. The siren bit the air, and the city parted like a wet negative in a wash. They drove toward the cathedral, where glass is not a window, but a lens that tells you what light thinks of you, where photographs are forbidden, because the building insists it is the camera where a man who loves frames could hide in plain sight and call it worship. Somewhere ahead, a shutter prepared itself calm and exact, unconcerned with law. Somewhere inside the nave, a chair would already be waiting in the perfect circle of colored light, and the author would have chosen his angle and timed the breath of the city to the rise and fall of a single hand. The cathedral rose out of the river's breath like a ship at anchor, windows smoldering with the last lit stain of evening stone ribs holding the sky in place while the city circled and pressed its face to the glass. Richter killed the siren a block away and coasted the car to the curb, letting the leftover rain hush their arrival. Guards at the side entrance met them with the wary stiffness of men taught to keep reverence from breaking. One recognized the badge and the story stamped on it and opened the door without asking questions he didn't want to own. Inside, the air was old wood and candle wax and the cool dust of centuries. The nave ran long as an avenue, pews lined like lanes, the altar a vanishing point where light made shapes out of silence. A sign near the entry reminded tourists not to photograph the holy. Tonight, the building would take care of the photography itself. Vogt's voice was a thread in the intercom perimeter, set 2 guards sweeping the gallery's Annetta, and a medic waiting in the south transept, Verena cuffed to a radiator in the church office, under a watch that did not blink. Richter walked the center aisle with the Leica heavy at his side, like a relic every step, a metronome counting how long it takes for a man to realize he is walking into a composition. He remembered Verena's mouth when she said pews as if she were teaching vocabulary. He remembered Felix's claim that he only collected moments while other people edited endings. He remembered Lena's fragment under glass. She writes too. She edits what I'm allowed to see. His eyes climbed the columns and found the circular gallery above where tourists usually leaned to let the city lift them. Tonight it was dark, and in the dark small lights glowed like LEDs hooded by care. A sound rose behind the altar, the gentle mechanical tick of a metronome. Not loud, not urgent, just a pulse. Richter veered toward it, boots whispering on stone. He rounded the choir screen and stepped into a side chapel walled with marble and colored glass. There, centered inside a circle of stained light, stood a chair. A frame rail ringed it thin as a line in a sketchbook. On a pedestal nearby sat a Polaroid printer patient as a predatory flower. Above the chair, fixed to the tracery like a spider's egg, a camera lens peered down. He tasted metal, the same metal he tasted inside every room the author built. "Do you like the light?" The voice arrived without direction, carried by the building the way prayer is carried when a throat fails. Felix stepped out from the shadow of a pillar, not furtive, not theatrical, simply present. He wore dark clothes that drank the color from the stained glass so that his face floated in a soft weather of reds and blues. No weapon. Hands loose in a way that said he trusted a composition to protect him. His eyes took in the Leica, the posture, the impatience in the jaw. "You brought her camera," he said, approving. "Good. She would have liked that." "Hands," Richter said, and Felix obliged, palms open to the nave. "Turn around," Richter added, and Felix turned, and the moment unspooled as if someone had pulled a tape and showed what honesty looks like on a man who lives on angles. Vogt crossed behind, done with reverence gun. "Steady breath, steady." "Where are the reels?" she said. "Master and corrections." "Not here," he said. "You found the box. Very good. The city is learning to keep what it finds." He cocked his head at the chair. "Sit, detective. Not a chance." Felix smiled the way a teacher smiles when a student insists on their first theory. "Then stand where I need you. There." He pointed to a spot on the stone where the colored light intensified a small stage made by a window that outlived the hands that cut it. Richter didn't move. The metronome ticked. Somewhere high, a pigeon cooed, obeying the acoustics. Felix shrugged and walked into the light himself as if to demonstrate the diagram. The printer snapped once, surprised into life. A white square rolled out and lay on the pedestal like a dropped card. Felix didn't touch it. "You came to arrest a lens," he said politely. "You can't. You can only change the light." "You drugged and staged and killed women," Vogt said. "You called it collecting moments. You watched yourself watching them. You built a story that didn't belong to you. I built a place where you would finally look," he said with no defense and no apology. Only this, that if the city refused to remember on its own, he would force it. She disappeared in rain and convenience store light and a professor's arrogance, and for 20 years you kept that story in a drawer labeled cold. Now you believe, because you have photographs. You call it evidence. I call it attention. His eyes flicked toward the altar where a red votive burned in a cup like a captured wound. "Attention is holy, detective. Ask this building." "Where is Lena?" Richter said the question, a stone that had been polishing itself in his throat for weeks. Felix met the word as if it were finally the right one. "Everywhere you are afraid to unwrap her," he said, and Richter saw in the corner of his eye without turning his head that the printer's white square had darkened, and it was the chair in an empty light, and the circle of color around it was a halo designed by a committee of dead men who believed they were making something untouched by cameras. "You think graves are holes?" Felix went on, "but a grave can be a method. A grave can be an archive." He nodded toward the nave. She wanted to be seen. "You all pretend you don't. This building knows better." "Stop circling," Vogt said. "You had help. Verena conserved what you broke and broke what we needed. Heinrich put his ego where your lens wanted it. Eric died because he finally tried to be the author instead of the camera. You are out of accomplices and out of time." Felix glanced at the metronome as if to consider her claim. "Time is a stupid editor," he said. "Look." He lifted one finger. Somewhere in the belly of the cathedral, a relay clicked and the building changed its breath. Lights dimmed on a schedule designed for tourism and replaced themselves with a focus designed for worship. The circle around the chair intensified, new glass humming under new angle. A line of LEDs under the choir rail awakened a landing strip for an arrangement no choir would sing. The printer trembled, accepting data from a feed Richter couldn't see. The white square it had recently produced lay now black with image. It showed the chair in the circle. It showed the camera above. It showed a man, at the edge of the frame profile, sharp hand lifted as if blessing the exposure. It showed Richter. He felt his own body look exactly like that, off to one side of intention face set in the calm people mistake for control. "You're not in the photograph because you shot it," Felix said gently. "You're in it because you exist in every room you try to control. I am offering you this stop trying to control the frame. Finish the exposure." By doing what Richter asked, and the Leica felt heavier, the strap burning a groove into his palm. By pressing the shutter at the right moment. Felix gestured with an open palm to the rails around the chair. When she sat there 20 years ago, this building made a negative. Verena preserved it. Heinrich pretended it was art. Your city called it rumor. Finish it. He nodded at the Leica. Take the picture that explains the picture. Then go arrest your conservator and your professor and write your press release and sleep. But finish this. For her. It's a trap, Vogt said. And the word was unnecessary because traps are only dangerous if you forget they exist. He wants you to put your eye to the viewfinder. He wants your hands on the mechanism. He wants a chain of touch. Chain of custody, Felix corrected. The phrase your lab loves. Make your own chain, make it unbreakable with your fingerprints. If you fear being part of the story detective, you shouldn't have chosen a job that writes its name under every photograph it touches. Where is she? Richter said again, not because he expected a different answer, but because he needed the cathedral to hear how questions persist. Felix's eyes softened in a way that almost made him human. Under the light that didn't move, he said, "You walked past it when you came in. People kneel there and call it relief. They feel better without understanding why the air is cooler. You brought the jacket and the hair out of the box and thought that was the grave. It was an index. The grave is a method. She is emulsion where the silver still knows what it saw." Speak plain Vogt said a warning to stop dressing harm in vocabulary. Beneath the altar, Felix said simply. Inside the reliquary base, not bones. The city wears her differently. Threads, fluids, resin in a seam. She asked to remain where attention gathers. Verena kept that promise even when she cut your book. If you open it, you will break what the faithful think cannot be broken. Silence opened its hands around the claim, and nobody in it allowed the sound they were making to be called belief. Richter's radio cracked a guard whispering about movement in the upper gallery. Vogt answered without taking her eyes off Felix, sending 2 uniforms toward the stairs, her tone the kind of calm that means panic is not an option. The printer clicked again. A second white square rolled out and began to darken. It showed the circle of light, the empty chair, the lens. It showed the shadow of someone stepping into the circle. It showed no face. It showed a posture that was about to become a body. Enough, Vogt said, and moved to cuff him. Felix did not flinch. He lifted both hands like a man who knows exactly how wide his wrists must be to accommodate rule. You can take me now, he said. You can take me later. But he will not leave this building while his frame is empty. Who? Richter asked the reflex, insisting there was still a pronoun left to burn. Felix smiled with a sudden flash of teeth that had nothing to do with kindness. The author. The one you keep trying to assign to a man with a camera, to a woman with a cabinet, to a son who wanted to be a mirror. The author is always the room. Finish the exposure. The metronome ticked, and something moved in the nave, a shadow that belonged to someone who should not be there. At this hour, a figure crossing the aisle in measured steps, hands folded as if holding prayer like a prop. The guards' voices rose in the rafters and then flattened, as if a hand had pressed the air into a drawer. The figure reached the circle of light and stopped, and every window in the cathedral gathered its colors around that halt. The printer murmured. The white square accepted ink. The camera above the chair breathed a tiny insect of glass, tasting the future. Richter lifted the Leica and looked without admitting he was looking. The viewfinder cut the cathedral down to a single geometry: the circle, the chair, the figure. In that rectangle, the world behaved. He could feel the pressure where the shutter would make a sound that changed nothing and everything. He lowered the camera and saw with naked eyes that the figure in the light was not a stranger. It was Professor Heinrich Stahl. Suit neat, face open in the way people mistake for innocence, eyes glassed with the blankness of a man whose memory has been edited by time and others. He did not look at Richter. He looked at the lens above his head, patient as a child who has been told to hold still. "Good evening," Heinrich said to no one, and everyone's voice echoing like confession. "I think I'm supposed to be here." Felix closed his eyes, a man hearing a chord resolve. Vogt's breath hitched with fury at choreography she hadn't chosen. Richter's finger found the shutter by instinct and then slipped away from it on purpose. The circle of light tightened as a cloud moved over something larger than any of them. Somewhere under the altar, a reliquary held a method in its seams. Somewhere in the church office, a conservator tested the strength of a radiator pipe with a wrist bone. Somewhere on the south side, a rescued woman kept her eyes open so the room could not make a photograph out of them without her consent. "Finish it," Felix whispered, not a command this time, but a plea, shaped like a prayer. "Give the city the frame it's been pretending not to need." Richter raised the Leica again and sighted the circle and knew that whatever he did in the next second would be the difference between a story that devoured itself and a story that left teeth marks on the truth. The metronome ticked once more and stopped, as if the building had taken a breath and decided to hold it. The finger that had learned to hesitate found the soft resistance of the shutter release, and, above the chair, the lens that had been patient for 20 years opened its eye. The shutter sound cracked the cathedral's ribs like dry ice on a hot plate, small and absolute, a syllable of metal that decided history. For a breath, nothing moved. The metronome held its last tick in its throat. The printer accepted the command that had been waiting 20 years and began to hum. A white square slid out with unhurried certainty and lay on the pedestal like a wafer offered to a congregation that had forgotten what it meant to swallow. Heinrich didn't blink. He sat with hands folded, just as the old art books show sitters when painters want them to be saints without miracles. Vogt kept her weapon low but ready, chin forward, eyes raking the aisles for the shape of a second act. Felix watched the white turn to gray. The gray to bruise the bruise, to picture the way men watch tides convince the sea behaves for them. The image thickened. The circle of stained light appeared first, then the chair, then the angle of Heinrich's jaw. But a second exposure bled up through the emulsion ghost light crossing the professor's face. Not a person, not a shadow. Writing. A sentence strung across his mouth in faint silver like breath in winter. When light meets shadow, she hides behind the lens. The line from Lena's diary hardened on the photograph, as if the cathedral had decided to print its own marginalia. Vogt hissed air through her teeth. Double exposure. No, Felix said, almost reverent. Memory. Richter moved without trusting motion. Stepped to the pedestal, bagged the print with the same care he would use to lift a newborn from a bath. The camera above the chair clicked again of its own accord, a second frame to confirm a first, and somewhere a relay reset. Heinrich flinched, now a small confession of flesh, and lifted his head to look not at them, but at the window where the color came from. "I was told to sit," he said, as if explaining a schedule. "I am here to be looked at." His voice wavered at the end, the way a candle does when someone opens a door behind you. "On your feet," Vogt said, stepping in. She cuffed him without ceremony. He didn't resist. He did not understand resistance. He understood instruction, and the room was full of it. She walked him out of the circle, careful not to let his shoulder brush the rail, as if contamination were contagious both ways. 2 uniforms took him, and the professor left the frame like a figure walking off a page he thought he'd been written into forever. Felix remained where the light had thinned. Hands still offered the arrogance of a creature who had never met the end of a staircase. "You'll tear the altar," he told Richter, conversational now. "You'll call it justice. They will call it desecration until your press conference teaches them a new word. Chain of custody. Richter said not to argue, but to hold on to a phrase that gave his hands a job. He looked down the nave toward the steps of the sanctuary, where tourists had taken their phones out all day and been told to put them away because the room insists it is the camera. His radio cracked again, a guard gasping that something in the upper gallery had moved, then vanished the breath of a curtain nothing to arrest. Secure the perimeter, he said, automatic, but his mind had already passed into stone. They approached the altar together, an escort of history and compulsion. A sacristan pale, with the knowledge of how quickly reverence can become evidence, appeared with a key that looked older than the case. "There is no compartment," he said, voice brittle. "It is solid. Then it will be solid, until it isn't," Vogt said, and he flinched at the precision. 2 crime scene techs arrived with blankets for the marble and tools wrapped like scalpels. The cathedral custodian protested, then nodded, then crossed himself in a motion that admitted he did not own the room he cleaned. They worked under the stained light like surgeons in a theater. The base of the altar carried a relief panel no one has thought about in 100 weddings, angels plucking at drapery that never moved. The panel had hairline cracks invisible until a flashlight dared them to confess. The adhesive bead beneath it had dried with the neatness of a conservator's hand. Verena's hand. Heat guns. Microspatulas. The angel loosened. The panel lifted. The cathedral changed its breathing, a long exhale from wood and stone and habit. Behind the panel, a void. Not bones, not an urn. The smell rose first, a blend of beeswax and resin and old water, and something that touched the back of the throat like a word you are not supposed to say. Inside the cavity, a cast. Not a cast of a face or a limb. A cast of negative space. A skin of transparent resin poured long ago over something soft, then hardened into a shape that remembered air itself. Suspended in it threads, fibers of fabric, hairs, a paper corner fossilized mid-flutter, tiny crystals like frost where fluids had dried and conspired with time. In the heart of it, a faint rectangular void exactly the size of a small notebook that had been removed or had dissolved or had never existed except as a memory you could hold in your palm and call proof. The light passing through the resin fractured into colors and spilled onto the marble like an apology. The custodian made a sound like a man remembering what he used to believe. Lena not as a body, but as a method. Lena as an emulsion that had been given a chapel. The city had preserved its crime the way museums keep saints in a medium that flatters attention and punishes neglect. Vogt reached out and did not touch. "Document it," she said, and the forensics team photographed from angles that did not insult the room. "We will not extract here," Richter said. "We bring the lab to the church. We do it where the light wrote it." Felix watched with that tilting curiosity that made him a dangerous witness. "You wanted coordinates?" he said softly. "You wanted a map. She is where people look. She always was. You just needed your own fingerprint on the exposure to admit you were seeing her." "Cuff him," Vogt said, not looking away from the cavity, and 2 uniforms took Felix by the shoulders as if lifting a dangerous instrument from a child who thinks it is a toy. He did not resist. He angled his head toward the reliquary void and said to either them or the resin or the idea of them, "Cold case isn't solved. It's developed." They moved quickly now, because speed is dignity when you ask a building to become a laboratory. A portable tent rose over the altar to keep pilgrims' eyes from turning evidence into theater. The sacristan paced like a man rehearsing how to forgive the future. Outside, the city built a perimeter with tape and curiosity. Inside, a narrow path opened that let the team carry the cathedral without touching it. Richter called the museum annex and ordered a transport case, inert gas humidity control, the vocabulary that makes crime feel less like grief. He dialed a judge for an emergent order. He dialed the prosecutor who had been waiting her whole career for a case that scared her this much. He dialed the press office and told them nothing except a time and a promise that truth would be a picture you could not ignore. He stepped aside for an instant that was only his and looked up into the gallery. A movement there, a person-shaped absence slipped between columns and became the building again. He thought of Verena's grid of slides, the neat labels, the calm of the hand that cuts and calls it care. He thought of Heinrich's sentence spoken by a man whose memory had been copyrighted by others. He thought of Lena's line printed across Heinrich's face, the diary refusing to be cut even when cut. When light meets shadow, she hides behind the lens. He looked at the Leica in his hand, at the print in its bag, and understood why his finger had found the shutter without asking permission. Some stories require your touch, or they don't exist. They brought Verena from the church office under double watch. Her wrists cuffed her mouth orderly. She stopped 3 paces from the tent and looked at the altar the way a mother looks at a shelf she has dusted every week. No drama moved across her face, only professional irritation. "Your humidity will be wrong," she said. "The resin will bloom if you rush." "You hit a woman in a reliquary," Vogt said. "You edited her warning into a riddle. You preserved a crime and called it culture." "I prevented Felix from burning what you see," Verena replied, calm as IV drip. "You can despise the method and value the result. That is adulthood. Ask your own profession." The printer at the side chapel clicked one last time as if to insist on an encore. A uniform plucked the square and brought it to Richter. The image was the circle again, empty now. No chair. No man. Only light. Across it, a hair lay like a line drawn by a human hand. Lena's hair. The identification would be scientific soon. For now, the eye knew before the test could nod. The square trembled minutely as it finished becoming itself. He slid it into a sleeve, labeled it with time and place and breath. He walked to Felix and looked at the face that had rehearsed attention into a weapon. "You will spend the rest of your life describing your intentions to rooms that don't care," he said. "You will never again be in charge of the light." Felix smiled like a man who liked challenges more than outcomes. "I don't need to be in charge," he said. "The city took the photograph for me." The night widened to include morning at its edges, that iron-gray Berlin hour when streetlights argue with birds. Outside, reporters grew as if watered. Inside, the tent glowed white as a confession booth. A conservator from the museum arrived. Not Verena, younger eyes swimming between shock and craft, and worked under Vogt's stare to secure the resin block for transport without removing it from the altar's mouth. A priest came and stood 40 feet away and said nothing and watched everything. The sacristan started to cry without making sound, the way old buildings make water when spring warms stone. Annetta, wrapped in a coat too big for her, walked into the nave on the medic's arm, stopped when she saw the tent, and then kept walking until she could place her palm on the railing that marked off the sanctuary. "Is she there?" she asked, not as a victim and not as a witness, but as a person who has spent 2 days being told to hold still and now chooses motion. "She is here," Vogt said, not lying. "She is everywhere you refuse to look away." Annetta nodded once, a movement that said she would outlive this room because she would not let it make a photograph out of her again. Sirens pressed softly against the stained glass. A judge's order arrived on a phone screen with language that bent law around awe. The tent unzipped in a whisper that sounded like a ribbon being pulled from a box you cannot afford. The resin block shivered when the cradle took its weight, then steadied as if agreeing to be carried. The panel with the angels leaned against a column, the angels collapsing their drapery with the patience of sculpture. The cavity yawned like a camera without a lens. Felix lifted his chin to feel the temperature change from sacred to procedural. "You want me to say I'm sorry?" he offered, testing a line to see if it fit. "I want you to say nothing," Vogt said, and for the first time his mouth closed as if it had just realized silence can be a verdict. They walked him out past pews that had held hundreds of frames for weddings and funerals and tourists, and people who discovered they were praying even when they thought they were posing. They walked Heinrich out past photographs that would not be taken. They walked Verena out past her own idea of permanence and into paper that would find a way to call her choices by their names. The building kept its breath held as long as it could, then let it out slow, a bass pedal that made the resin hum. Richter stayed a moment longer, hand on the cool rail, the Leica heavy. the bagged print warmer than it should be. He looked once more at the cavity and the negative that had been a grave and at the circle of light that would be empty for the first time in 20 years. He felt the city's eye open and blink and open again. He felt the case not solved, but printed. Outside the first cameras, the cathedral does not allow, waited for pictures of the boxes that would bring the inside out. Inside, a detective became what he had always been without admitting it, a person who decides where to stand, so that when the truth finally appears, it has a place to land. He turned and walked toward the doors, and the nave accepted the motion and made it part of its geometry. Behind him, the metronome started again by itself. Slow, patient, counting down not to an ending but to the moment a negative meets paper and accepts that being seen is a kind of burial. Dawn pressed a colorless thumb across the city and left streaks on the river. Berlin blinked, found its reflection altered, and pretended it had always looked this way. The cathedral steps became a mouth that swallowed and released uniforms and crates, and faces learning how to carry a new vocabulary. The resin block traveled under white shrouds and gray breath escorted by a silence that only sirens could translate. Reporters reached for metaphors and caught rain. The headline had already written itself in 1,000 drafts of appetite, cold case transformed into reliquary. Missing student recovered as method. Richter signed where the chain of custody told him to sign-watch the forms take on weight, and felt the Leica's strap bite his palm, like a reminder that objects change hands faster than stories do. Vogt supervised the transfer with that clipped tenderness she uses on anything that once held a pulse. She said please to a conservator, said yes to a priest, said no to anyone who tried to touch the frame of the morning with an ungloved hand. At headquarters, rooms created for the ordinary grind of theft and quarrel strained to hold a case that had borrowed theology. Evidence lockers inhaled a new sacredness and kept their mouths shut. The lab sealed a chamber for the resin-tuned humidity, calibrated light, as if speaking to an animal that frightens easily. On the first pass, swabs lifted a constellation of proof hair consistent with Lena's samples from old hairbrushes her mother had kept, like a superstition fibers, that matched the jacket preserved in Verina's cabinet trace chemicals from developer fluid that dated to a small window in 2003 when one manufacturer altered its recipe and then changed it back. Silver salts etched a patient map through the resin, a memory of exposure hard as stained glass. You could read the chemistry like a diary if you knew how to listen. Heinrich sat in a chair in a room without stained light and confused the ceiling with a moral. Competency hearings wrapped him in phrasing the way gauze wraps a cut you won't admit came from your own hand. He remembered what he was told to remember, and anything outside of that looked at him through a fog that let him wave. Sometimes he called the detective professor, and sometimes he asked if the class would be graded on a curve, and sometimes he said Lena's name with the relief of a person who thinks confession is a kind of key. When the prosecutor asked him why he had sat in the circle at the cathedral without protest, he smiled with a child's blankness and said he liked good light. The judge stared over her glasses like a camera that refuses to blink and ordered more evaluations, a language for deciding whether a man is unfit to stand trial or perfectly shaped to play innocence in a room that demands a villain. Verina didn't request softness. She requested precision. The woman who had made a vocabulary of care into a weapon didn't flinch when the questions cut along the grain. She admitted custody of reels and receipts, admitted edits to a diary, admitted the creation of a reliquary that turned absence into a medium, and then refused to attach verbs more violent than preserve. You call it concealment, she said, voice, even eyes lit with a scholar's confidence that correctness is its own defense. I call it stabilization. If I had not curated those materials, Berlin would have misplaced its memory yet again. The prosecutor asked about consent, and she met the word with a coolness that turned the room's temperature down a notch. You ask the dead for consent every time you archive them, she said. The difference is I listened. When the defense suggested that the resin cavity honored Lena Verina's mouth, pressed a fraction thinner, and she gave a lecture on the ethics of funerary casts. When the defense suggested that without her, there would be nothing, Vogt's chair creaked like a warning, and the stenographer's fingers hesitated as if ink could register disapproval. Somewhere between worship and crime, Verena kept her balance with a conservator's hands and waited for the court to decide whether to call her work a sarcophagus or a cabinet or an accessory. Felix wore custody like an outfit he intended to improve. The interview room turned into a gallery, not because he spoke like a curator, but because he arranged his silences, the way he arranged frames, precise and provocative, and timed for resonance. He refused a lawyer with theatrical patience, accepted one when the court assigned it, thanked him like a man tolerating an usher. He did not deny staging, did not deny supervision, did not deny that Annetta had been placed inside a light that called itself art. He denied harm the way a lens denies being a face. "I do not touch," he said. "I position." Every time the prosecutor pushed the verbs toward assault, he softened them with placement and context and intention until the words slid off the table and lay on the floor between their shoes. The lab handed Richter copies of a life's work on the condition that no copy could flatter the original. The reels marked master and corrections, bled scenes into monitors, and made technicians draw their mouths thin. They found in the audio a cough that matched Heinrich's old faculty recordings, found in the reflections a woman's profile, whose bun and posture matched Verena's archive photo, found in the light the unmistakable texture of the cathedral's lenses. If narrative is a rope, enough fibers twisted together starts to carry weight. Annetta slept, then rose, then learned how to try a sentence with the first-person pronoun in it, and not feel the frame close around her throat. She sat with a trauma specialist who asked questions like an archivist, careful patient unwilling to mislabel. She told them about the chair and the timer and the voice that praised her for holding still. She told them about the way the camera made a sound that felt like a bite. She did not cry when the lawyer asked if she had eaten, if she had peed, if she had thought about dying. She cried when Vogt asked her how the room smelled. "Like a patience you didn't want to understand," she said, and the court reporter wrote the sentence with a small tilt to the head, like a person hearing music for the first time. Days later, when they brought her to the cathedral as a witness to the place that had tried to convert her into an image, she walked to the rail again and put her palm down, not in prayer, but in refusal. "I am not a photograph," she said, and the sacristan nodded as if that were scripture. The city tried to take a breath and coughed on its own headlines. A camera crew rehearsed grief at the curb where candles forgot which woman they were for. Students marched from the university to the museum with placards that said, "Attention is not consent, and do not archive me while I'm alive." Another group carried signs that said, "Never bury us again," and cold does not mean quiet. A think piece called Verena's Cabinet an altar to male gaze and was corrected by a letter that reminded readers it had been a woman's hand that cut the book. Talk shows pushed chairs together and allowed people to pretend microphones can erase harm. In a courtyard, a mural rose of Lena turning her head to look at the lens and refusing to disappear. Someone added a second figure behind her, a blurred silhouette with a camera, and someone else spray-painted a third hand in the corner, holding a pen. By nightfall, the mural had already learned to defend itself with flowers taped to the wall and a grandmother correcting a tourist's angle. The lab printed an answer in the language that juries understand. DNA from the resin aligned with Lena's family to a degree that turned doubt into a gesture no one could comfortably hold. Microplastic analysis nested the cast in the early 2000s. Residual chemicals from developer trays matched the tunnel site. Traces of camphor matched the museum lab. The jacket carried cat hair that matched a cat that died in 2009 in an apartment registered to Felix. A fiber from the cuff matched a scarf seen in a 2003 photograph of Heinrich walking out of the convenience store. Chain of custody tightened itself like good string. When Richter finally slept, the cathedral's circle of light followed him behind his eyelids and kept asking for a shutter. He would wake with the taste of metal and find the Leica on the chair by the door, the bagged print on his desk, the metronome of the precinct humming through the walls. Vogt slept badly, and then slept like the dead, and then woke ready to argue with anyone who mistook poetry for proof or proof for closure. They met in the corridor, where the paint color is called neutral, and shared a coffee that tasted like copying. They wrote their report with an attention that honored, if not satisfied, a name that had been used by too many mouths. They wrote the phrase cold case in a way that made the words wince. They wrote the word solved and let it sit until it felt like a photograph of a door that might or might not lead outside. The trial calendar moved like a barge through a canal, slow, inevitable, needing tugboats. Felix's counsel filed motions to suppress anything that touched religion and anything that touched art. The court reminded him that murder does not become installation when you light it well. Verina's counsel argued intent, argued preservation, argued that removing the diary page prevented a scapegoat. The court reminded her that redaction is power, and that power employed without consent is a cousin of harm. Heinrich's hearings weighed capacity like a scale broken by decades of performance and a late crush of truth. Somewhere in the tangle, a prosecutor sharpened opening statements on a whetstone of rage and mercy. Somewhere else, a public defender stared at the resin photograph of heir turned memorial and wondered how many words it takes to make a jury look away. On the day the lab handed over the final report, the sky decided to be bright for a page and the river pretended to be anything but witness. Richter walked to the cathedral on purpose and left the Leica at his desk, like a choice not to bring a weapon to a room that had already been one. Inside, the circle of light had moved with the sun and lay across empty stone. The altar wore its temporary absence with a patient dignity. A notice explained the work with a grammar that had learned to say, "We know you are grieving," without telling you what you are allowed to feel. The sacristan nodded at the detective as if they were co-workers now, and went back to polishing a rail that had been touched by more hands than any case file could count. He sat in a pew and let the room's lens act on him until breath settled. Cold case, he thought, and the words no longer meant no suspect, or no evidence, or no hope. They meant a negative kept in the dark until the light and the hands were right. Detection had been an act of development. The city had been the dark room. The people who refused to look away had been the enlarger and the paper and the tray. He closed his eyes and heard the metronome that had started by itself the night before, slow and deliberate counting as if time were a liquid you pour from one container into another without spilling. When he left the nave, he turned toward the museum annex because endings are just corridors between rooms. He walked the hallway that led to the conservation lab and stood outside the door where the nameplate had been unscrewed and the adhesive still clung like a tacky ghost. Inside, a younger conservator with steady hands monitored gauges and logged humidity and looked up long enough to nod as if to say, "We are keeping together what should not have been broken." He did not enter. He did not need to. He had already seen enough rooms teach him how they wished to be named. Back at his desk, he took the Leica apart with the reverence of someone cleaning a wound. He wiped old fingerprints and thought of all the hands that had tried to own a story by touching it. He slid the camera into an evidence bag and labeled it with a calm that surprised him, as if putting the lens to bed also put a portion of the city's appetite to sleep. On the wall, the evidence board had been cleared for a new case, but the ghosts in the pushpin holes refused to leave. The string lay coiled like a vein, learning its next body. He tucked the bagged print into a drawer that locked with a click, the room accepted as punctuation. Night returned like a developer bath, turning the day's pale shapes into something the eye could hold. Vogt knocked once entered, without waiting, sat on the corner of his desk and blew on her tea like it was film she didn't trust. "You know they'll ask you why you pressed the shutter," she said, not accusing. He nodded. "I'll tell them the city asked," he said. "And I answered." She nodded back in agreement that belonged less to law than to language. "Then we'll teach them a new word for closure," she said. "One that doesn't mean forgetting." Outside, someone lit the candle at the corner where a convenience store still throws its tired light into the rain. A student left a spiral notebook in a plastic bag underneath it and wrote on the cover in a hand that did not tremble. "We see you." A grandmother adjusted the candle so the wind would stop reading over their shoulders. Somewhere, a camera shutter tried to practice that small, absolute syllable that changes nothing and everything, and finding no permission stayed still. Inside the precinct, the metronome stopped because someone unplugged it to vacuum, and the silence that replaced it sounded like a room learning to breathe without a machine. The resin block would spend months in a lab and then years in a courtroom, and then a lifetime in a narrative that refuses to be edited by one author again. The diary page would be read into the record and misquoted by strangers and still keep its warning sharp. The cathedral would teach tourists to lower their phones and raise their eyes. The river would forget every headline and remember every light. Richter stood turned off his desk lamp and watched the window make a rectangle around a city that had learned for a minute how to see without wanting to own. Cold case, he thought, and did not add solved. He added developed. He added witnessed. He added not buried. Then he went home and for the first time since the frame opened slept without light on his eyelids.